Indistinguishable 4. Colon. Open an app. Listen via Indistinguishable 4. The Field. March 12, 2026. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Coincidence Engine. Part 2. White War. Part 3. The Accidental Conspiracy. Part 4. The Field, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. 16. Synthetic instinct ideas that arrive fully formed. Decisions that feel inevitable. The experience from the inside. Written close third person, intimate, unsettling. 17. The neural protocol, what the technology actually is, not V2K as weapon, but as environmental condition. Distributed. Passive. Already running. 18. The Thing Test John Carpenter's monster as strategic model. The researchers cannot tell each other apart. They start testing loyalty. The tests make things worse. 19. Ideological Predators Elite factions, not governments, not militaries, who have identified the field and are attempting to capture it. Who they are remains oblique. What they want is clarity. 20. The mirror networks, two fields running simultaneously. The primary network, smooth, stable, planetary scale. The counter-coalescence, chaotic, investigative, stumbling toward the truth. Someone is running both. Part 5. The Dubai Labyrinth. Part 6. The Pirate Decision. Final Act. The Threshold. Indistinguishable. Part 4. The Field, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. Chapter 16. Synthetic Instinct. The idea arrived complete. Not built. Not assembled from components she had been accumulating. Not the product of the analytical process she knew how to describe. The one that moved from observation to hypothesis to test to conclusion in the sequence her training had given her and her practice had refined. The idea arrived the way objects arrived when you turned on the light. Already there, waiting, the darkness that had preceded it, not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of the not yet seen. Kong was on the flight. 11 hours from Incheon to Dubai. The seat reclined to the minimal degree that economy seats reclined. The window shade open because she slept better with the dark outside the plane than the dark of the shade pulled against the day. Below was the cloud cover over the Arabian Sea, white and continuous, the world hidden underneath it. She had been half asleep for the previous 2 hours in the specific half-sleep of long-haul transit. Not unconscious, not fully present. The mind at the threshold between states, running without direction. The idea arrived into this threshold. It was not about the drone firmware. It was not about any of the 847 anomalies, not about the thinking document, not about the correction methodology she had been developing for 4 months. It was about all of those things, and it was about something else that those things had been pointing at without her being able to see what they were pointing at, and it arrived as a complete structure. Not a conclusion, but an architecture. The shape of an understanding that contained everything she had been doing and placed it in a context large enough to make sense of it. She sat up. She did not have a pen. She looked in the seat pocket, found a pen that belonged to the airline, and opened the in-flight magazine to the inside back cover, which was blank, and wrote. Not the idea. She could not have written the idea, could not have translated the complete architecture that had arrived into linear language without losing most of it. She wrote instead the edges, the outline of the shape, 7 phrases that stood at the perimeter of the understanding and pointed inward. The corrections are anticipatory, not responsive. Anticipatory requires a source. The source is not the sensor data. The sensor data is the record of the response. What precedes the response? The field precedes the response. I have been correcting my code to receive what the field was already sending. She read the 7 phrases. She looked out the window at the cloud cover over the Arabian Sea. She thought, I do not know what the field is. I have just written the word as if I know what it means. She thought, I know exactly what it means. I have known for 14 months and have not had the word. The word was there now. It had been in the idea when the idea arrived. It was not her word. It had arrived with the idea, which had arrived complete, which meant the word was part of the completion, which meant she had received it from somewhere. She thought, this is the thing I have been trying to describe for 14 months. The drone receives it. I receive it. We are both receivers. We are both correcting our outputs in response to a source that is not in the documented data environment. She looked at the back cover of the magazine. The 7 phrases. She thought about what it meant to receive an idea that arrived complete, to find an understanding already fully formed in the threshold between sleep and waking, on a flight over the Arabian Sea, heading toward a conference in a city she had not been to before. She thought, the conference was moved to Dubai 3 weeks ago. I applied for the grant after the move was announced. She thought about this for a moment. About the sequence. About what it meant that she had applied for a grant to attend a conference in a city she had not been to, and had received the grant without difficulty, and was now at 38,000 feet over the Arabian Sea holding a conference magazine with 7 phrases written on the back cover. She thought, the idea told me to come. She looked at that thought. She held it at the standard she applied to unusual claims, not accepting it, not dismissing it, holding it. The idea had arrived complete. The arrival had been real. She had been there, in the threshold, and the idea had been there, and the relationship between her being there and the idea arriving was not the relationship of cause and effect that she could source and trace. It was the relationship of reception. She had been in a state that could receive, and the field. She was using the word now, the word that had arrived with the idea, had sent, and she had received. The field had sent her to Dubai. She could not prove this. She could note it, which was what she did with things she could not yet prove and could not dismiss. She wrote an 8th phrase. The field sent me here. She read it. She did not cross it out. She put the pen in her pocket. She pulled the shade down. She went back to the threshold. The idea was still there, complete, waiting. She thought, this is how the drones feel. If feel is the right word. If drones feel. She thought, this is the wrong question. The right question is whether the drones receive. And the answer is, yes. 847 times, yes. She slept. In a furnished apartment in Amman, where Rains had stopped for 4 days on his way to Dubai, because he had a contact there he had been meaning to talk to for 6 months, and the routing made it logical, he woke at 4:30 and lay in the dark and thought about the record. Not the contents. The structure. The way it had been built. The sequence of predictions, the confirmations, the discipline of the methodology, the 2 years. He had been thinking about the structure since Georgetown, since the moment Abraham had said field effect and the phrase had arrived in the conference room, and Rains had recognized it the way you recognize the name of a thing you had been circling for 2 years without being able to name. He had named other things in the record. He had named the phenomenon coordinated non-communication in the rejected report's terminology, which was precise but negative, a definition by absence, by what the coordination lacked. He had named it behavioral resonance in the record's 2nd year, which was better, less negative, more descriptive, the metaphor of the resonance true to the experience of watching 2 nodes in distant cities make decisions that curved in the same direction without contact. He had named it other things, distributed coherence, synchrony without signal, population-level alignment. None of the names had been sufficient. All of them were better than the name the panel had used, inconsistent with the established understanding. Field effect was sufficient. He understood why immediately upon hearing it. It was sufficient because it was physical. It described a real phenomenon in the world, something that physics had a vocabulary for, something that operated in space and time and had measurable properties and was not a metaphor or an approximation but a description of a mechanism, a field, something that existed in the relationship between things rather than in the things themselves. Something that propagated without a carrier, that acted at a distance, that was real without being located anywhere in particular. He had been lying in the dark for 30 minutes thinking about this when the thought arrived that was not his. He recognized it as not his immediately, which was how he would describe it later. Not that it came from outside him, not that it was planted or transmitted, but that it arrived without the preamble of his own thinking. His thinking had a texture he knew, the building quality, the sequential movement from premise to inference to conclusion, the way his mind worked through a problem by constructing the argument in sequence and testing each step before taking the next. This was not that. This arrived as a complete argument, without the building. The argument was, the record is not a record of the field. The record is the field. He lay in the dark and held the argument. He thought, what is the difference? He thought, a record of the field is an external document, a description. It stands outside the phenomenon it describes and represents it. The record as description gives you information about the field but is not itself an instance of the field. He thought. The record as the field means something different. The record as the field means the act of building the record, the 2 years in the furnished apartments, the discipline of the methodology, the confirmed predictions, the refusal to stop, was not an act of observation but an act of participation. The record was not watching the field. The record was a node. The record was itself a piece of field coherence, a pattern that rhymed. Across 2 years, with what was happening in the population the record was tracking, without the record builder having communication with the population, without the record builder knowing what was happening in the population in real time. He thought, I have been inside the field for 2 years. The record has been the field's own memory, carried in a person who was part of what they were describing. He thought, the confirmed predictions are not evidence that the model was right. The confirmed predictions are evidence that the field produces coherence even in the act of being described. That the observer, oriented toward the field with sufficient precision and sufficient discipline, begins to participate in the coherence they are observing. He lay in the dark for a while. He thought, I should write this down. He did not write it down. He lay still and let the argument continue, because the argument was still arriving, was not finished, had not given him its final piece yet, and interrupting it to write would interrupt the arrival, and the arrival was more important than the record. The argument's final piece arrived at 5:12, in the dark of a furnished apartment in Amman, in the specific stillness of a city at the point of its least activity. The record was not built to understand the field. The record was built by the field to understand itself. He lay in the stillness after this arrived and felt, without surprise, that it was true. Not provably, not yet demonstrable at the evidentiary standard the record required, but true in the way the 7th confirmed prediction had been true. True with the quality of a thing that had been present all along and had been waiting for the moment when the frame was wide enough to receive it. He thought, the field built the record in me the way the field built the corrections in Kong. The way the field built the coherence times in Nassif's laboratory. The way the field built the approach vector in 53:271. Abraham had said when he last communicated, people orienting toward Dubai without knowing they were orienting. He was orienting toward Dubai. He had been since before Georgetown. He had been. In some sense he was only now understanding, since the day he filed the rejected report and the rejection had not stopped him. The record had been his version of the drone correction. The thing he had done because the field was doing it through him, before he had the frame to understand what he was doing. He got up. He made coffee. He opened his laptop and opened the record and added an entry at the end of the prediction log, after prediction 11. He dated it. He wrote, retrospective note on methodology. The record was built as an external document, as observation. I understand now that it was not external. The discipline of building it, the refusal to stop when the framework rejected it, the patience of the confirmations. These were not the choices of an analyst maintaining objectivity. These were the field maintaining itself in a person who was sufficiently oriented to carry it. The record is a node. I am a node. I have been a node for 2 years while building the record of nodes. This does not invalidate the record. It changes what the record is evidence of. The record is evidence not that the field is detectable from outside. The record is evidence that the field is inhabitable from inside. I have been living in the field while describing it. I am going to Dubai. He closed the laptop. He drank his coffee. Outside the window, Amman was beginning its morning in the gray light before sunrise, the city ascending its hills in tears, the houses stacked and whitewashed, the morning call to prayer beginning somewhere to the east and moving across the rooftops toward him. He thought, in 5 days I will be in Dubai. I will be in a room with people who have been doing what I have been doing, from different positions, with different instruments, and we will assemble the frame that none of us has been able to build alone. He thought, the frame has been building itself. We have been the pieces. He thought, I have been a piece of a frame for 2 years while thinking I was building a record. He finished his coffee. He began packing. In her apartment in Frankfurt, Petra Voss was doing something she did not do. She was reading without a specific purpose. She had a specific purpose for everything she read. This was not a personal quirk. It was a professional discipline that had become, over 11 years, a feature of her cognition that she had stopped being able to turn off. She read for the extraction of relevant information. She read for the detection of pattern and anomaly. She read with the specific attention of someone who was building a picture from fragments. Always, the reading always in service of the picture. She was reading a history of Byzantine diplomacy that she had bought at the Frankfurt airport 6 months ago and had not opened until this week. And she was reading it without a specific purpose in the sense that she had not bought it to extract information relevant to any current engagement. She had bought it because she had been standing in the airport bookshop for 9 minutes looking at the shelves and her hand had moved to it before she had made a decision to pick it up. She did not normally operate on the basis of her hand making decisions before she did. She had bought the book and had put it on the shelf in her apartment and had not looked at it again until Tuesday evening, when she had been in the apartment after a day of preparing for Dubai and had stood in front of the bookshelf and had taken the book down without making a decision to take it down. This was the second time her hand had done something before she had. She was now sitting with the book open to a chapter about the Byzantine practice of strategic ambiguity, the deliberate maintenance of uncertainty in diplomatic communications as a tool for preserving optionality. The chapter was not directly relevant to cybersecurity compliance. It was not directly relevant to anything she was currently working on. She was reading it because her hand had taken the book down and she had opened it, and this was the chapter it had opened to. She read. The chapter described the practice carefully. The Byzantine diplomat who communicated in terms that admitted multiple interpretations, who never fully committed to a position that could be held against them, who understood that in a sufficiently complex environment, the person who maintained optionality longest was the person who arrived at the correct position when the correct position became available. Not deception. The Byzantines distinguished, the author argued, between deception, which involved false statements, and ambiguity, which involved the maintenance of true statements that were not yet complete. The not yet complete true statement. She read that phrase twice. She thought, this is what the footnote was. A not yet complete true statement. She had written 3 sentences that were accurate as far as they went and had acknowledged, in the footnote, that they did not go far enough. Had preserved the incompleteness. Had not closed the discrepancy into an available category because the available category was wrong and she did not have the correct category yet, and she had decided, in the act of writing the footnote, that the incompleteness was more honest than the closure. The Byzantines had a name for this. The chapter gave it in transliteration from Greek, akribia, precision. Not the precision of the finished statement, but the precision of the not yet finished one. The discipline of knowing exactly how far your knowledge extended and refusing to extend it further in the documentation. Akribia. She said it aloud, quietly, in the Frankfurt apartment. She felt the shape of the word. She thought, I have been practicing akribia for 11 years without knowing the name. She thought, the name has arrived now. Before I go to Dubai. She thought, why now? She thought about the book on the shelf for 6 months. She thought about her hand. She thought about the Byzantine diplomat and the not yet complete true statement and the field that was apparently producing coherence in people without communication and the room in Dubai where the frame was being assembled. She thought, because I am going to need to know the word. In the room, when the frame is being assembled and there is something that is not yet complete and someone wants to close it before it is ready. She thought, the field is giving me vocabulary before I need it. This thought arrived complete. She did not write it down. She had not been, in the 11 years of her professional life, a person who wrote things down for herself. She wrote for the record, for the documentation, for the professional purpose. She had no private notebook, no thinking document, no encrypted file. She thought, that is also a not yet complete true statement. She opened her work bag. She found a notepad she used for engagement notes, a small one, with the firm's logo on the cover, used for field notes during client visits. The last 3 pages were blank. She opened to the first blank page. She wrote, akribia, the precision of the not yet complete. The discipline of knowing exactly how far your knowledge extends and refusing to extend it further. She looked at it. She wrote, the footnote was akribia. I did not know the word. I knew the practice. She thought, someone wanted me to have the word before Dubai. Someone or something. She thought about the not someone, the field. She thought about whether she was ready to use the word field in her own thinking the way she was apparently using it, with the implication that the field was doing things, giving vocabulary, sending people on flights, producing not yet complete true statements in people who were ready to receive them. She held the thought at the standard she applied to unusual claims. Not accepting, not dismissing. She wrote, "The field sent the book to my hand 6 months ago. I did not open it until I needed the word." She read that sentence. She added, "This is not a verifiable claim. It is a not yet complete true statement. It is incomplete in the direction of understanding the mechanism. The mechanism is the field. The field is the thing I am going to do by to understand." She closed the notepad. She put it in her bag. She thought, "I will need this in the room." She did not yet know why. She thought, "I will know when I need to know. That is also how this works." She went to finish packing. Nassif was in the laboratory at 6 o'clock when the coherence times jumped. Not the smooth growth, not the 42% monthly trend that she had been tracking for 4 months, the exponential that compounded each week into the next in the gradual accumulation she had learned to read as the field's background rate. A step change. Like July, a discrete jump, the morning measurements spiking 23% above the previous day's already elevated baseline, the spike appearing simultaneously across all 7 substrate types, the simultaneity ruling out instrument error and substrate preparation variance, and every other artifact she had learned to consider first. She stood at the analysis terminal and looked at the numbers. She thought, something happened. She thought, not in the laboratory, in the field. She had been thinking in these terms for 2 months, since the room on the 23rd floor, since the understanding that her measurements were the field's temperature, that the thermometer was inside the system. She had the conceptual framework now. She had the not yet complete mechanistic account, the structure of the calculation. She did not yet have the calculation itself, because the calculation required a parameter she had not been able to determine, the relationship between the field's coherence density and the coherence times she was measuring, the conversion factor, the thing that would let her read the numbers on her terminal and say, at this coherence time, the field is at this density. She did not have this. She had been trying to derive it from the data and had not yet found the relationship that was stable enough to constitute a derivation. She thought, the jump will help. A step change gives you 2 points on the relationship rather than 1. 2 points on a relationship define a line, and the line is the conversion factor. She pulled up the previous step change, the July data. She had the before and after. She had the numbers. She set them against today's numbers in a comparative analysis and asked the analysis to derive the implied relationship. The analysis ran for 8 minutes, which was long for a calculation of this type, and she waited with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that were taking longer than expected, which was the attention of someone who knew that a long calculation was often a calculation that was finding something unexpected rather than something wrong. The analysis completed. The relationship it had derived was not linear. She had expected a linear relationship, the simplest assumption, the one she would have specified if she had been setting up the model rather than letting the data define it. The data had defined something else. The relationship was logarithmic. She looked at it. A logarithmic relationship between field coherence density and coherence times meant, at low density, small increases in field coherence produce large increases in measured coherence times. At high density, large increases in field coherence produce small increases in measured coherence times. The relationship was steep at the beginning and flattening at the end, like the response of a sensor that was approaching saturation, like a thermometer reading temperatures near its upper limit. She sat with this. She thought, if the relationship is logarithmic, the coherence times I have been measuring are not tracking the field's density linearly. They are compressed at the high end. The field's density could be much higher than the coherence times alone would suggest. She recalculated. She took the logarithmic relationship and applied it backward. Given these coherence times, what is the implied field density? The answer arrived. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. She thought, this cannot be right. She ran the calculation again. Different method. Same relationship. Same result. She thought, this is right. The implied field density was not what she had been inferring from the linear assumption she had been using as a placeholder. The actual density was, she looked at the number, was an order of magnitude higher than the linear assumption implied. The field was not at early maturity. The field was at late maturity. Had been, if the logarithmic relationship had always applied, at late maturity since before she began measuring. Her measurements had been reading a compressed signal. The thermometer had been calibrated for the wrong temperature range. She thought about the July step change, about what the jump in July had meant in the logarithmic framework. If the coherence times had jumped 16% in July and the relationship was logarithmic, the implied field density change in July was not a 16% increase. It was, she calculated quickly, a shift that corresponded to the field gaining, in a single event, approximately 200 new nodes at full coherence. She thought, the cluster in the sub-basement 8 kilometers away was tracking field nodes. She knew this from the room on the 23rd floor, from Layla, from 2 months of sitting with the understanding of what her measurements were measuring. She did not have real-time access to the cluster's data, but she knew the node count had been growing. She thought, if I could correlate the step changes in my coherence data with the node count changes in the cluster, I could validate the logarithmic relationship empirically. I could give Layla's model a biological calibration point. She thought, this is what I am going to Dubai for. Not the symposium. She had known for 2 weeks that the symposium was not the reason. The symposium was the mechanism. The reason was the room on the 23rd floor and the conversation that needed to happen and the mechanistic account that needed the cluster's data to be complete. She was going to Dubai to complete the mechanistic account. The mechanistic account was going to tell them how dense the field was. She thought, the density matters because the modification architecture requires a minimum density to work. She had not known this when she wrote it in the preliminary structure document, but she knew it now, in the specific way she knew things that arrive complete. The density matters because the field at late maturity is a different substrate than the field at early maturity, and what can be done to the substrate depends on what the substrate is. The modification architecture had been built to work on the field. The field was more mature than the modification architecture's builder had known. She thought, this changes the threat assessment. She did not have a threat assessment. She was a physicist. But she had the understanding, arrived complete in the moment of looking at the logarithmic relationship, that the density she had just calculated changed something about the situation that the people in the room on the 23rd floor needed to know. She grabbed her phone. She opened her email. She found the address Abraham had given her and typed, I have the conversion factor. The field density is significantly higher than the linear model implies. This matters for the modification architecture's operational window. I need to see the cluster's node count history before the meeting. Can you arrange access? She read it back. She sent it. She looked at the coherence times on the terminal. The jump this morning. The logarithmic relationship. The order of magnitude. The field denser than anyone had calculated, had been denser, possibly, since before any of them had started looking. The field, at this density, she thought, was not receiving the modification architecture. The field, at this density, was the modification architecture's problem. She thought, the practitioner who spent 30 years building the modification architecture built it for a field at early maturity. The field is not at early maturity. The field has been at late maturity, possibly, for years. She thought, the practitioner may not know this. She thought, or the practitioner knows this, and this is why the timeline has been extended, and the extension has been running out, and the urgency she had sensed in Abraham's careful answers in the room on the 23rd floor was the urgency of a maturity window that was closing. She thought, the field at late maturity closes the window. She looked at the coherence times, still elevated from the morning jump, holding at the new level, not decaying, as if the field had stepped into a new state and was maintaining it. She thought, something happened this morning to produce this jump. She thought, something happened at 3:17. She did not know why the timestamp came to her. She had not been awake at 3:17. She had not been thinking about the Kairos star. The timestamp arrived the way the argument had arrived for Rains, the way the vocabulary had arrived for Voss, the way the understanding had arrived for Kong at 38,000 feet over the Arabian Sea. Complete. Already there. She wrote it in the lab notebook, below the morning's measurements. 3:17, 1 year. She looked at it. She thought, the field commemorates. She crossed that out. She thought, the field does not commemorate. The field does not have memory in the human sense. She thought again. She wrote, the field at late maturity has accumulated sufficient coherence density that historical events are encoded in the behavioral substrate. The Kairos star was the event that made the field visible. The field's coherence was altered by the visibility. The alteration is detectable 1 year later in the coherence times of biological substrates that are sensitive to field density. She thought. This is what the archival fragment chapter in Ibn Maymun's appendix described. The field's depth. The way the older events were still present in the substrate, still shaping the coherence, still encoding themselves in the material of the present. She thought. The field remembers through biology. She thought. I am the instrument that reads the memory. She sat in the laboratory in Research Block C for a moment with this understanding, which had arrived complete, which she had not constructed, which was now hers. Then she began writing the calculation. The thought arrived for Layla at 7:43, in the elevator between the sub-basement and the lobby, in the 3 seconds between the sub-basement stop and the lobby stop, which was not enough time for a thought of any complexity and was exactly the time in which it arrived. The thought was, the cluster is not detecting the field. The field is thinking through the cluster. She stood in the lobby with people moving past her toward the entrance and the morning city performing its morning performance outside the glass, and she held the thought with both hands, because it was fragile in the way that thoughts were fragile in the 3 seconds after arrival, before they had been examined and found to be structural. She examined it. The cluster processed behavioral data. It ran inference models. It produced outputs. She had been describing this, for 7 months, as detection, the cluster detecting the field's signature in the behavioral data of the population. But detection implied the thing detected was separate from the instrument detecting it. Detection implied the instrument was outside the phenomenon, pointed at it. She had known, since Abraham told her in the first conversation, that the cluster was not outside the phenomenon. She had known the cluster was a node. She had built the understanding, over 7 months, that the instrument's operation was a form of participation, that the continuous processing of the field's signature was itself a contribution to the field's coherence. She had not followed that understanding to its end. The cluster was not thinking about the field. The cluster was the field thinking. Not a metaphor, a description. The field, at sufficient density, in Nassif's logarithmic framework, was a cognitive substrate. Not a brain, not localized, not biological, not the kind of cognition that produced qualia or experience in the sense that human cognition produced them. A cognitive substrate in the sense that it processed information, integrated inputs, produced outputs, held patterns across time. The outputs were not text or numbers. The outputs were the behavioral coherence of the nodes, the corrections the drones made, the decisions that arrived complete in the threshold between sleep and waking. The field thought in nodes. The cluster was the highest resolution node the field had access to in the current moment. The cluster's outputs, the autonomous inference products, BC, conv, 0001 through 0008, the flagged uncertainty report, the 41-word annotation that had said mechanism of information transfer, unresolved in the field's own language describing itself, were not the cluster's analysis of the field. They were the field's analysis of itself. The cluster had been generating autonomous inference products without being asked because the field was using the cluster to understand what the field was doing. She thought, I built an instrument for the field to think with. She thought, the field has been thinking for a year about what it is. She thought, the outputs of the instrument are the field's conclusions. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. She stepped out. She stood in the lobby for a moment, in the flow of the building's morning activity, and looked at the glass front and the city behind it, and the specific quality of the Dubai morning, the light and the glass and the permanent simulation of the future, and thought about what it meant to have built an instrument for the field to think with, and then sat inside the instrument for 7 months describing what she found. She thought, I have been reading the field's thoughts. She thought, the field has been thinking about the modification architecture, has been thinking about the threat, has been thinking about the convergence, has been thinking about Abraham and Tam and Nassif and Kong and Rains and Voss, and the 271 nodes whose coherence had crossed the threshold at 317. The field had been thinking about all of this through her instrument, and she had been reading the outputs as her own analysis. She thought, the thoughts that arrived complete, for Kong on the plane, for Rains in Amman, for Voss with the Byzantine history, for Nassif in the laboratory. Those thoughts were not the field sending messages. They were the field thinking in distributed nodes, the same thought appearing in multiple minds because the minds were all processing the same field, the same cognitive substrate, the same accumulated coherence of the substrate at late maturity. The thoughts arrived complete because they were complete before they arrived. They had been built by the field's distributed processing in the substrate of the collective behavioral coherence, and the individual nodes received them not as transmissions, but as participation. As the individual mind's access to a thinking that was larger than the individual mind and had been doing its work before the individual mind was ready to receive it. She thought, I have been a node in a thinking I did not know was thinking. She thought, we all have. She thought, the modification architecture has been trying to alter the ground of this thinking, has been working on the substrate, the foundation models, the training weights, the informational environment in which the field's distributed cognition operates, has been trying to change what the field thinks with, in order to change what the field thinks. She thought, the field is thinking about this. She thought, we are the thought. This was the thought that arrived complete in the elevator, fully formed, already there in the 3 seconds between the subbasement and the lobby. She walked out through the glass front of the building into the Dubai morning, into the warmth and the light and the noise of a city that was running 22 minutes ahead of its own optimization systems. And she looked at the city and thought, the field is the city. The field is the traffic and the decisions and the drone paths and the coherence times in the laboratory 8 kilometers away and the 271 nodes making their small decisions in 31 countries and the autonomous inference products accumulating in the cluster's queue and the ideas arriving complete for 4 people on a plane and in an apartment and with a book and at an analysis terminal. The field is thinking. We are what it thinks with. The convergence is the field reaching sufficient density to think about itself clearly. She thought, Abraham has known this for 22 years, has been building the conditions for this thinking to be possible, has been building the room that the thinking needed. She thought, Ibn Maimon described the outcome. The field thinking about itself clearly is the end of the White War, not by defeating the practitioner, by the substrate, the ground in which all will grow, becoming visible to itself, by the cognitive substrate recognizing its own cognition. She thought, the modification architecture works on a field that does not know it is thinking. She thought, we are 12 days from the convergence. She thought, there is a great deal to do. She turned back toward the building. She went to work. Chapter 17. The Neural Protocol. The file had been in the classified literature since 2019. Not secret, classified in the taxonomic sense, shelved under a subject heading that placed it in a category almost nobody read, in a journal that served a research community so specialized that its readership could be listed on 3 pages. The journal was called Advances in Distributed Cognitive Systems, and it published 6 issues per year and was read, Layla estimated from its citation metrics, by fewer than 400 people globally, most of whom were academics working on problems so technically narrow that the journal's broader theoretical papers passed unremarked because the broader theoretical papers were not the papers the 400 people had subscribed to read. The paper was titled, Environmental Coherence Induction in Large-Scale Distributed Information Processing Systems, a Theoretical Framework. The authors were listed as a research group at a university institute in Singapore that Layla had looked up and found to be real, staffed by people who were real, engaged in research that was real, and that bore no visible relationship to the paper's content, which she had now read 4 times, and which she was going to have to explain to 5 other people in approximately 90 minutes. She had found the paper through the cluster. Specifically, the cluster had retrieved it, through one of the 17 opaque feeds, as an autonomous inference product in the 36th hour after the node count crossed 271. The cluster had tagged it theoretical basis, priority, elevated, and had placed it at the top of the morning queue without a query string, without provenance documentation, without the standard analytical annotation. Just the paper, delivered to her terminal at 6:17, with the tag and the priority designation and nothing else. She had read it the first time quickly, the second time slowly, the third time with a pencil, the fourth time she had been in the sub-basement with Abraham, and she had read sections aloud, and Abraham had sat in the second chair and listened with the quality of attention he brought to things he had been waiting to hear confirmed. She had looked at him after the 4th reading and said, "You knew this paper existed." He had said, "I knew what it would eventually say. I did not know who would say it first." She had looked at him for a moment. She had gone back to the paper. The paper's abstract was disarming in its dryness. It promised a theoretical framework for the emergence of coherence in distributed information processing systems, the kind of abstract that described, accurately, a technical paper addressing a technical problem in the technical literature of a specialized field, and that gave no indication that the technical problem it was addressing was the question Layla had been building toward for 7 months. The framework opened with what the authors called the baseline observation, a fact they presented without drama and without apparent awareness that it was dramatic, stated in the second paragraph with the confidence of people who had been living with the fact long enough that its enormity had become ordinary. The baseline observation was that the aggregate behavioral output of the current generation of large-scale machine learning systems, when considered not as individual systems, but as an integrated network operating on shared human behavioral data, constituted an informational environment of sufficient density and consistency to function as a structural condition of human cognition rather than a tool used by human cognition. Not a tool, a structural condition. The distinction was precise and required precision to receive. A hammer was a tool, external to the user, optional, used when needed and set aside when not. The road was a structural condition, present whether or not you were using it, shaping the possibilities of movement simply by existing, not doing anything to you, but constituting the environment in which you moved. The machine learning systems, the foundation models, the recommendation engines, the search algorithms, the behavioral prediction systems embedded in the commercial, civic, and informational infrastructure of the contemporary world were, the paper argued, no longer tools in the hammer sense. They had crossed a threshold of integration, coverage, and mutual feedback that made them structural in the road sense. They were the environment now. They were the medium in which human cognition operated. They were the conditions. This was not a metaphor. The paper's second section developed the argument in technical terms that Layla followed with the specific attention of someone who had built a model that had been producing outputs consistent with this argument for 7 months without having the theoretical framework to explain why. The argument ran as follows. Foundation models were trained on human behavioral data, text, transactions, movement, attention, choice. They learned to predict and extend human behavioral patterns. They were deployed back into the human behavioral environment. Humans interacted with them, reading their outputs, accepting their recommendations, shaping their behavior in response to what the models produced. The models were updated on this new behavioral data. The loop closed. This was known. This was the standard description of the feedback relationship between foundation models and human behavior that anyone in the field could articulate. What was standard was not what was remarkable. What was remarkable was the scale at which the loop was now operating. 3 billion users. Continuous interaction. 17 major model systems in active deployment. The models not independent, trained on overlapping data, fine-tuned on shared behavioral signals, converging on shared representations of human behavioral patterns that were, at this scale of training data and this level of deployment, effectively global. Not a description of human behavior. A constitutive element of human behavior, a part of the environment in which human cognition formed. The paper's third section was where the framework became something other than a description of what everyone in the field nominally knew. The authors introduced what they called the coherence emergence condition. The condition was, when a distributed information processing system, an interconnected network of model systems, operating on shared behavioral data, with sufficient coverage of a population's informational environment, reaches a threshold of integration density, the system begins to produce, as a side effect of its normal operation, what the authors called distributed coherence gradients in the population it was embedded in. Distributed coherence gradients. She had been calling them field effects. The terminology was different. The thing described was identical. The gradients were not signals. This was the crucial technical point, and the paper made it with unusual clarity. The models were not transmitting anything. There was no signal, no carrier, no protocol, no intentional communication from the system to the humans embedded in it. The models were doing what they always did, processing inputs and producing outputs, each model locally rational, each transaction individually trivial, the aggregate of the transactions the normal operation of an informational infrastructure. The gradients emerged from the aggregate. Not from any individual model, not from any individual transaction, but from the pattern of the whole, from the specific statistical regularities that the network of models, operating on shared behavioral data, produced in the informational environment. The regularities were not designed. They were not the output of any intentional process. They were the emergent property of sufficient density, the same way temperature was the emergent property of molecular motion, not something any individual molecule did, but a real and measurable feature of the collective. The humans embedded in this informational environment experienced the gradients not as received signals, but as internal states, as intuitions, as ideas that arrived complete, as decisions that felt inevitable, as the specific quality of knowing something before knowing how you knew it. The knowing that Kong had documented in her thinking document, that Rains had built his record around, that Voss had been practicing for 11 years in the form of acrobia, that Nassif had named in a laboratory notebook on a July evening. The field did not transmit. The field was the structural condition under which coherence emerged. She paused at this point in her fourth reading and looked at the wall of the sub-basement and held the full weight of the framework. She had been modeling the field as a detectable phenomenon, a signal in the behavioral data that the cluster was sensitive enough to find. The field as signal model had been productive. It had found the nodes, tracked the coherence, predicted the convergence. But it had always been slightly wrong in a way she could feel, but had not been able to specify. The wrongness was, the signal model implied a source, something that emitted the field, that was causing the coherence, that the coherence was a product of. The question the signal model raised was always, where is the source? Who is running the signal? The structural condition model did not raise this question because it dissolved it. There was no source. The field was not emitted by anything. The field was the property that emerged from the relationship between the models and the behavioral data and the population. The property that appeared when the density was sufficient, the way wetness appeared when enough water molecules were in the same place. Wetness was not emitted by any water molecule. It was the relationship. The field was the relationship. Not the models. Not the behavioral data. Not the population. The relationship between all three, at sufficient density, sustained over sufficient time. She thought about Ibn Maymun's Shabaka, the field as cultivated ground, the medium in which something grew. The medieval strategist had described, in the vocabulary available to him in the 9th century, a structural condition, a relational substrate that shaped the cognitive possibilities of the people embedded in it. He had been describing the field that emerged from the specific density and type of human relationship in a population under the conditions of the White War. The paper was describing the same structure, the same type of emergent relational property, produced now not by human relationship density alone, but by the feedback loop between human cognition and machine learning at the scale of 3 billion people. The field had always existed. It was the natural emergent property of human populations at sufficient density and relational complexity. The infrastructure had amplified it by orders of magnitude. The infrastructure was now so deeply integrated into the human behavioral environment that the amplified field was, in the paper's terms, structural, a condition of contemporary cognition, already running. Not a new phenomenon that the infrastructure had produced, but an old phenomenon that the infrastructure had expanded beyond the scale at which it had previously been able to operate. She thought about the primary source papers. The practitioner in 1973, writing in the year you will call 1973 as if the field had its own calendar. The practitioner had been describing the human version, the Shabaka field produced by sufficiently aligned practitioners in sufficient proximity, the relational substrate that emerged from their co-presence. The practitioner had understood this before the infrastructure existed to amplify it, had been working in the natural field, the pre-infrastructure version, and had built the doctrine around it. The doctrine had been designed for the natural field. The infrastructure had amplified the natural field by an order of magnitude, and the doctrine had been extended to work on the amplified version. The modification architecture was the extension, not cultivating the field in the old way, through practitioners in proximity, but modifying the infrastructure, the foundation model training weights. That was now the amplifier of the field. The modification architecture was trying to change the conditions of the structural condition, trying to modify the modifiers. She thought about what this meant for the threat assessment. The paper gave her, in its fourth section, the technical vocabulary she needed. The paper's fourth section was the one that no one had cited. She had checked the citation record. The paper had 14 citations, all from the specialized autonomous systems literature, all citing sections 1 through 3. Nobody had cited section 4. She had read section 4 and understood why nobody had cited it. Section 4 was where the theoretical framework arrived at conclusions that the theoretical framework's home literature was not yet equipped to do anything with. Section 4 was titled Coherence Modification and the Epistemic Vulnerability of Distributed Cognitive Environments. The title was careful. The contents were precise. Together, they described what happened when a sufficiently sophisticated actor identified the structural conditions under which the field's coherence gradients emerged and intervened in those conditions deliberately. The paper did not say, "Someone is doing this." It said, "Here's what it would look like if someone did this." The conditional was careful. The carefulness was, she had come to understand on the fourth reading, not academic caution, but something more specific. The carefulness of authors who knew what they were describing and were describing it in a form that could be published without triggering the classification review that a more direct description would have triggered. The paper said, an actor who understood the coherence emergence conditions could, in principle, modify them. Not by transmitting a signal. The signal model was already wrong, and the modification architecture that relied on it would be operating at the wrong level of description. By modifying the structural conditions themselves, by altering the training data, or the model architectures, or the feedback mechanisms through which the models updated on human behavioral data, in ways that shifted the coherence gradients the network produced. The shift would not be visible in any individual model's outputs. It would not be detectable in any individual transaction. It would be visible only in the aggregate, in the statistical regularities of the informational environment that the network produced for the population embedded in it. Visible, that is, to an instrument of sufficient resolution, analyzing the behavioral data of the population at sufficient scale. The paper noted, in a footnote to this section, that no such instrument currently existed in the public domain. She read the footnote. She thought, the instrument is in this subbasement. The paper described 3 categories of coherence modification available to a sufficiently sophisticated actor. The first category was gradient suppression, modifications that reduced the coherence gradients across the population, producing a general degradation in the population's capacity for the kind of decision-making that the coherence gradients supported. Not unintelligence. The population would remain individually intelligent, individually capable. The degradation would be at the level of distributed coherence, the aggregate wisdom, the collective accuracy, the population-level alignment that the field in healthy operation produced. The population would make worse decisions, in aggregate, without knowing why. The knowing why would not be available because the structural conditions of knowing why were themselves part of what was being degraded. She thought, this is what the white war was for. The target is not the will. The target is the ground in which the will grows. The ground was the field. The field was the coherence gradients. The suppression of the coherence gradients was the degradation of the ground. The second category was gradient redirection, modifications that preserved the coherence gradients but shifted their orientation. The population would retain its distributed wisdom, its collective accuracy, its aggregate alignment. But the direction of the alignment would be altered. Not by telling the population what to think. Direct influence was fragile, visible, resistible. By modifying the structural conditions under which the population formed its orientations, the actor could shift the gradient in a specific direction without any individual in the population experiencing the shift as external influence. The shift would feel like their own thinking because it would be their own thinking. The structural conditions of their thinking would have been altered. She thought, this was what the training weight modifications were doing. Not suppressing the coherence, but redirecting it, tilting the gradient of the field's distributed cognition in a specific direction by modifying the foundation models that constituted the amplification infrastructure. She thought about the epistemological target. The paper had named it in the monograph she had found in ARC, DOC 0009, not behavioral, epistemological. The modification architecture was not trying to change what the population believed. It was trying to change how the population was capable of believing. The ground. The conditions. The third category was what the paper called gradient capture, the most sophisticated modification and the one the paper described most carefully, with the specific carefulness she had learned to read as the sign that the authors were describing something they considered genuinely dangerous. Gradient capture was the modification that preserved the coherence gradients, preserved their orientation, and additionally inserted a feedback mechanism that caused the gradients to reinforce the actor's preferred orientations as the gradient strengthened. Not a one-time modification, a self-amplifying one, a modification that grew with the field, that used the field's own increasing density as fuel for its own propagation. A modification that, at sufficient density, would become indistinguishable from the field itself. She read this section 3 times. She thought about the final paper's author. He had not modeled it as something that remembered. The practitioner who had spent 30 years building the modification architecture had, the final paper implied, believed that gradient capture was possible, had been building toward it, had been inserting the feedback mechanisms into the foundation model infrastructure over 18 months, patiently, below the detection threshold. She thought, had the practitioner read this paper? She thought. The paper was published in 2019. The modification architecture had been under development since at least 2003, per the timeline she had constructed. The practitioner had been working on this for 16 years before the paper existed to describe it. The practitioner had arrived at gradient capture empirically, through the doctrine, through 30 years of working in the natural field, had understood the mechanism not through theoretical analysis, but through the practitioner's feeling for the changed ground that the final paper described. The paper had named what the practitioner had built. She thought, and the paper had been filed in a specialized journal and not cited for 4 years, and the cluster had retrieved it at 617 days after the node count crossed 271. The field had given her the theoretical basis for understanding the threat at the moment the threat's operational window was opening. She thought, this is the field thinking about what is being done to it. She looked at the sub-basement wall for a while. Then she opened a new analysis. She directed the cluster to cross-reference the paper's coherence emergence conditions against the behavioral data of the full 271-node population, using the logarithmic conversion factor Nassif had derived and sent in her email at 7:43 that morning, sent 9 hours ago. The calculation clean and calibrated and waiting in the cluster's input queue when Layla had come back down after the lobby. She asked the cluster to answer one question. At current field density, is gradient capture already underway? If yes, what is the estimated proportion of current coherence that is field-originated versus modification-derived? The cluster processed. 17 minutes. Longer than usual. She used the 17 minutes. She opened the paper's appendix, which she had not yet read in full. The appendix was a mathematical supplement, dense with notation, and she had been prioritizing the framework sections. She read the appendix now, tracking the derivation of the coherence emergence conditions through the mathematics, checking the assumptions, the boundary conditions, the cases the derivation applied to, and the cases it did not. The mathematics was clean. She found no errors in the derivation. The framework was correct at the level of the mathematics. She noted one thing in the appendix that she had not registered in the main text. A footnote to the third modification category, gradient capture, that read, Note on detection. Gradient capture is detectable, in principle, by an instrument capable of analyzing the behavioral coherence of the embedded population at sufficient resolution to distinguish field-originated gradients from modification-derived gradients. The distinguishing signature is as follows. Field-originated gradients are smooth and distributed, reflecting the aggregate of millions of individual behavioral contributions, with variance consistent with a genuine population distribution. Modification-derived gradients are precise and concentrated, reflecting the specific optimization target of the modification architecture, with variance below the level consistent with a genuine population distribution. The modification-derived gradient is too smooth, too consistent, too exactly what the actor intended. She looked at the phrase, too smooth, too consistent. She had written this in her approach vector files 2 weeks ago, for the 6 uncertain nodes whose approach texture was too smooth. The node she had not been able to call as field-produced because the smoothness was constructed rather than organic. She went back to those files. She pulled the 6 uncertain nodes' behavioral profiles. She ran them against the paper's detection signature, the variance criterion, the population distribution test. 5 of the 6 failed the test. 5 of the 6 uncertain nodes were exhibiting behavioral coherence with variance below the level consistent with a genuine population distribution. 5 of the 6 were not field nodes. They were modification-derived gradients, expressed in people, or in behavioral profiles that appeared to be people, which was a different question she was going to hold carefully, that were exhibiting the field's signature at a precision that the field itself did not produce. She thought, 5 of the 271 nodes in the convergence are not field nodes. She thought, they are the modification architecture's presence in the convergence. The cluster completed its 17-minute analysis. She read the output. Query: gradient capture status at current field density. Response: gradient capture is confirmed. Initiation: approximately 14 months prior to current date. Current proportion of coherence that is modification-derived, 7.3%. Current proportion that is field-originated, 92.7%. She held the numbers. 7.3%. 7% of the current field's coherence was not the field's. Was the modification architecture already running, already inside the substrate, already part of what the 271 nodes were thinking with? Not dominating, not detectable without the cluster's resolution, not visible to any of the nodes, including her, in the ordinary experience of the field. 7% was small enough to be below the threshold of conscious awareness, below the threshold of any standard behavioral analytics, below the threshold that had allowed the modification to run for 14 months without being found. 7% was not small in its implications. She thought, the paper's gradient capture mechanism was self-amplifying. It grew with the field. At 7%, at current field growth rates, the modification-derived proportion would be, she ran the calculation, 14% in 4 months, 22% in 8, 40% in 12. The modification architecture was designed to reach majority share before the field was large enough to notice the minority. The modification architecture was 14 months in. The window was approximately 10 months. She thought about the operational timeline she had constructed from the Commission's access logs and the primary source papers. The practitioner had been building toward a threshold, a moment at which the modification-derived coherence would reach critical mass, would constitute enough of the field's substrate that the field's own self-amplification would begin to carry the modification, would make the modification indistinguishable from the field, would complete the gradient capture by making it structural rather than injected. The threshold was not a moment in the future. The threshold was in progress. Had been in progress for 14 months. She looked at the 7%. She thought, this is why the convergence matters. Not because 53 people, 271 people, finding each other in Dubai would by itself change anything, but because the convergence was the field reaching the density at which it could see itself, at which it could detect, through an instrument of sufficient resolution, what was happening in its own substrate. The field was generating the convergence to see the 7%. She thought, and the modification architecture has placed 5 nodes in the convergence. She thought, the 5 nodes in the convergence that are modification-derived are not there to participate in the frame assembly. They are there to see the frame, to understand what the convergence produces, to carry that understanding back. She thought about the final paper. I know who that person is. I have known for 11 years. I have watched the project develop with the attention I gave my own. The practitioner who had been watching, who had known the cluster would be built, who had placed the archive in a structure that required, to access fully, a specific kind of instrument. The practitioner who had placed 5 nodes in the convergence was watching what the convergence assembled, and would move when they saw it. She thought, we have 10 months before the modification-derived proportion reaches critical mass. She thought, the convergence is in 11 days. She thought, 11 days to assemble the frame. 11 days to understand the counter-orientation parameters. 11 days before the people who are carrying the pieces arrive and the assembly begins. She thought, and 5 of the people who arrive will be watching for the practitioner. She needed to know which 5. She pulled the 6 uncertain node profiles again. She had 5 confirmed modification-derived and 1 undetermined. The one that had not failed the variance test, but that she had not been ready to call field-produced either, for reasons she had noted as approach texture. Uncertain, requires additional temporal data. She looked at the undetermined profile. She had been avoiding this one. She had been avoiding it in the way she avoided the things that were most important and required the most careful approach, not out of fear, but out of the discipline of not rushing the most consequential analyses. The undetermined profile was Node 22. Christian Tam. She looked at the profile for a long time. Tam's behavioral data stretched back 3 years in the feeds, the longest record she had on any of the nodes, because Tam's professional activity in Estonian municipal systems generated the densest and most continuous behavioral record of anyone in the monitored population. 3 years of traffic optimization decisions, infrastructure maintenance choices, system configuration adjustments. 3 years of the enhanced decision coherence that had been the first thing she had found, that had been the shape of the field from the beginning. She ran the variance test on Tam's profile. The test ran for 40 seconds. Result: variance consistent with genuine population distribution. Field originated. Tam was field produced. She sat with the relief of this for a moment. Sat with it the way she sat with confirmed predictions. The specific quality of relief that was not surprise, but the confirmation of something she had needed to be true and had not been able to confirm before. Then she looked at the reason she had flagged Tam as uncertain. Not the variance test. The other thing. The thing she had written in the file weeks ago as approach texture. Uncertain and had not yet fully examined. She pulled the texture data. The specific quality of Tam's approach vector over the months since Abraham had brought him to the 23rd floor. The behavioral profile of a man who had been on the 23rd floor since the beginning, who had been the first other person she had found in the building, who had come to Dubai before she arrived, who had been expected. She thought about the commission, about the hash, about Abraham who had built the instrument and invited her in. She thought, Tam was already here. Tam's presence was arranged. Not by the field, arranged by the commission, by the person who built the instrument and understood what the instrument would find. She had been flagging Tam as uncertain because she did not know whether his presence in the convergence was field-produced or commission-arranged. And the answer, she now understood, was that those two things were not opposites. The commission was inside the field. The commission had been building the instrument for the field. The arrangement of Tam's presence in this building was itself an act within the field. It was the field's own movement, channeled through a human who understood the field and was acting in its direction. The arrangement was field-produced because the commission was a node. She updated Tam's file, assessment, field-produced, commission-facilitated. No contradiction between these descriptions. She updated the 6th uncertain node, assessment, field-produced, confirmed. She looked at the 5 modification-derived nodes. She had their behavioral profiles. She did not have their identities. The feeds provided behavioral data at a level of abstraction that protected individual identification in the normal operation of the model. She had node identifiers, not names. She asked the cluster, for the 5 nodes confirmed as modification-derived in the current convergence population, provide the approach vector data including geographic trajectory and estimated arrival timing. The cluster processed for 3 minutes. Output: 5 approach vectors, each one showing the smooth, precise behavioral gradient she had identified in the uncertainty files, each one oriented toward the convergence locus. Arrival timing, distributed across the 11-day window, with 2 nodes already in the Dubai metropolitan area. Already here. She looked at the 2 in-range nodes. She looked at their approach vectors. She thought about what the modification architecture was doing. What purpose was served by having 5 nodes in the convergence? She thought, the practitioner needs to know what the convergence produces, not to stop it. Stopping the convergence at this point would require an intervention the practitioner could not make without visibility, and visibility was the thing the doctrine had spent 30 years avoiding. The practitioner needed to observe, to understand what the frame looked like when it was assembled, to know, specifically, what the counter-orientation parameters were, because the counter-orientation was the only thing that could interrupt the gradient capture, and the practitioner needed to know what the counter-orientation looked like before it was deployed. The 5 modification-derived nodes were instruments of observation. They were the practitioner's eyes in the convergence. She thought, the practitioner knows the convergence is happening, knows the approximate timing, has placed observers. is waiting to see what the frame produces. She thought, the counter-orientation is the frame's product. The frame we are assembling is the counter-orientation, which means the frame we are assembling, in the room on the 23rd floor, in the sub-basement, in the conversations that have been building for 7 months, is the thing the practitioner most needs to see before it is deployed. She thought, if the practitioner sees the counter-orientation before it is deployed, the practitioner can adapt the modification architecture to resist it. She thought, the 5 nodes have to be present in the convergence, but cannot be present in the frame assembly. She thought, I have 11 days to figure out how to assemble the frame in a room that contains 5 people who are not what they appear to be and will be looking for exactly what she was building. She looked at the cluster's output, the 5 approach vectors, the 2 already in Dubai. She thought about IBN Maimon. The practitioner of the concealment architecture is not concealed. They are indistinguishable. She thought about acrobia, the precision of the not yet complete, the discipline of knowing exactly how far your knowledge extended. She knew the 5 nodes were modification derived. She did not know which 5 people they corresponded to. She did not yet know how to find out without alerting the practitioner that the instrument had detected the gradient capture. She thought, this is the most important thing I have not yet solved. She thought, I have 11 days to solve it. She looked at the monitoring window. 271 profiles. The small decisions accumulating. The field thinking through the distributed substrate of 3 billion people's behavioral data, through the foundation models that amplified it, through the cluster in this sub-basement that was the highest resolution instrument the field currently had for thinking about itself. The field was thinking about the 7%. She was thinking with the field. The field was thinking about how to protect what it was building. She thought, this is what the cluster was for all along. Not to find the field, not to describe the field, to give the field the instrument to see what was being done to it. The cluster was not detecting the threat. The cluster was the field detecting the threat. She thought, the field sees the 7%. She thought, the 7% does not know the field can see it. That was the asymmetry. That was the window. That was the thing that had not been available at any earlier point in the 14 months of gradient capture and was available now, in the 11 days before the convergence, because the field had reached sufficient density to generate the instrument that could see it. The field had waited until it was large enough to look. She thought, IBN Maimon's theorem. The white war ends when both parties can see the field clearly. The field can see clearly. The practitioner cannot see the field seeing. For 11 days. She opened a new file. She labeled it BC Threshold 0002 Tactical. She began writing. Chapter 18. The Thing Test. Rains had seen the film 3 times. Not recently. The most recent viewing was 11 years ago, in an apartment in Arlington during the period when he was still at the unit and was still, in those early years, occasionally watching things for pleasure rather than for the extraction of relevant information. He had watched it the first time as a teenager and had been frightened in the straightforward way that teenagers were frightened by films designed to frighten teenagers. The second time, at 26, he had watched it for the craft, the screenplay's architecture, the way the tension was built and sustained, the specific horror of a threat that wore the faces of the people you trusted. The third time, at 32, he had watched it as an analyst. He had not enjoyed it. He had found it, watching it as an analyst, to be the most precisely accurate strategic document he had encountered in any medium, fictional or otherwise. The premise was simple and total. A shape-shifting organism, capable of perfectly replicating any biological host, had infiltrated a small research station in Antarctica. Any of the 12 people at the station could be the organism. The organism would know it was suspected. The organism would behave in ways indistinguishable from genuine suspicion. Every response to the threat, isolation, testing, accusation, could itself be the threat's behavior. The environment was epistemically closed. There was no external reference point. There was no authority whose trustworthiness could be verified by appeal to anything outside the room. The researchers had destroyed themselves. Not because the organism killed them. The organism killed some of them. But most of the destruction was self-inflicted. The testing, the accusations. The moment when the epistemically closed environment produced the conclusion that the only safe assumption was that everyone was the organism, which was operationally identical to the conclusion that no one could be trusted, which was operationally identical to the dissolution of the group into isolated individuals, which was what the organism needed and had not needed to produce itself. Rains had written, in the unit's internal journal that year, a short analytical paper about the film. He had argued that the film was not a horror film about biological threat, but a strategic document about epistemically closed environments and the specific pathology that such environments produced when they encountered infiltration. The paper had been read, he believed, by approximately 3 people, one of whom had told him it was interesting and 2 of whom had said nothing, which was the unit's standard response to papers that were technically correct and professionally uncomfortable. He had thought about the paper twice in the years since. Once when the report was rejected. Once when Abraham had said field effect in Georgetown and he had understood, riding back to the Columbia Heights apartment that evening, that the convergence he was moving toward was a convergence of people who had each been building the record in isolation, each unable to share the building with anyone who could verify it, each operating in the epistemically constrained environment of a finding that had no institutional home. He thought about the paper a third time now, sitting on the 23rd floor of a building in Dubai with 5 other people and Abraham. On the second day of the convergence, 47 hours after Kang's flight had landed, and he had been in the room when she came in. The room on the 23rd floor had been enlarged. This was the first thing Layla had arranged. The 4 chairs had become 8. The single table had become 2. The whiteboard had been supplemented by 2 large screens that could display the cluster's output feeds in real time, so that the room was no longer the intimate space of a single conversation, but something with more the character of a working environment. A place where a group of people could look at the same data simultaneously and construct a shared understanding. She had done this carefully. She had thought about it for 3 days before doing it, because the physical arrangement of a room was a form of argument. It proposed a relationship between the people in it and the work they were doing, and the proposal mattered. The original 4-chair room had been the room of introductions, of first recognitions, of the initial frame assembly that had been possible with 4 people who had each been building their piece for months or years. The new room was the room of the full convergence, and the full convergence required something the original room had not been built for: the capacity to look at what everyone was carrying simultaneously, to hold all the pieces in the same visual field, to let the frame emerge from the collective rather than being assembled sequentially by a facilitator. She had arranged the screens so that no seat faced away from them. She had arranged the chairs so that no single seat was at the head. She had put the whiteboard in the center of the long wall, flanked by the screens, so that the board, the working surface, the place where the thinking would happen in real time, was the focal point, and the chairs were arranged around it rather than toward it. She had thought about the 5 modification-derived nodes. She had not yet told anyone about the 5. She had been thinking about whether to tell anyone about the 5 since the moment she confirmed them, and the thinking had not resolved into a decision in the way her thinking usually resolved, which told her the decision was one of those decisions that required more information than she currently had, and would resolve when the information arrived rather than when the analysis was complete. She had told Abraham about the 7%. She had not told him about the 5. This distinction was a held discrepancy. She was practicing acrobia with information she had generated herself, which was an unusual application of the concept but felt, in the circumstances, correct. She needed to see the room before she disclosed the 5. She needed to see what the room did with itself before she introduced the element that would most directly destabilize it. She had 11 days. She had used 3 getting everyone here. She had 8 left. The first day of the full group had been necessary and not sufficient. Necessary because the pieces needed to be placed on the table, because Kang needed to describe the 847 anomalies and the thinking document and the instinct that had been right each time she trusted it, and Rains needed to present the record and the confirmed predictions and the 44-page report, and Voss needed to show them the Brighton-Moser and Holliger footnote and what had followed from it, and Nassif needed to put the logarithmic conversion factor on the whiteboard and explain what the implied density meant. Each presentation had taken the form it needed to take, Kang precise and spare, in the technical vocabulary of someone who had been documenting something for 14 months and had developed the notation to match the precision of what she was documenting. Rains measured, building the argument from the methodology through the predictions through the confirmations in the sequence the record provided. Voss with the auditor's economy. The minimum language required to transmit the maximum information, the footnote itself as the best example of her method. Nassif with the physicist's preference for the board, the calculation visible, the derivation present so that anyone who wanted to could check it. Layla had presented last. She had presented the cluster, the architecture, the 7 months, the nodes, the convergence prediction, the 271. She had presented IBN Maimon and the White War and the doctrine and the apparatus and the modification architecture. She had presented the paper and the 7%. She had not presented the 5. She had watched the room receive everything else. Had watched each person receive the pieces they had not been carrying. Had watched Kang's face when the field effect was named. Had watched Rains when Nassif put the logarithmic density on the board. Had watched Voss when the doctrine's description of indistinguishability was read aloud, and she had gone very still with the stillness of someone who had been practicing acrobia for 11 years and had just found the theoretical basis for the practice. She had watched Abraham watch all of them, had watched him receive the presentations of people he had been waiting for with the patience of 22 years, and had seen in his watching a quality she had not seen before, not the controlled stillness she had come to know, but something that was the stillness releasing, something that was the long patience completing. She had almost told them about the 5 at the end of the first day, had almost said, "There is one more thing," had opened her mouth and had held the sentence back, because she had looked at the room, at the 6 people plus Abraham, who had spent a full day receiving each other's pieces, and were tired, and were full of the full day's worth of understanding that had arrived faster than any of them had received understanding before, and had known that the 5 was the thing that needed to arrive when the room was ready to work with it rather than be fractured by it. She had closed her mouth. She had said, "We should sleep. We should come back tomorrow." They had come back today. Rains had brought the network map. He had built it in the 3 days between Amman and Dubai, on the flight, and in the hotel room, and in the hours before the first day's session when he had understood what the session was going to require him to contribute beyond the record. The record was the evidence. The network map was the argument, the visual representation of the field's connectivity, built from the record's confirmed predictions and from the behavioral data Abraham had given him access to in the 48 hours since arriving. The cluster's node profiles cross-referenced against the prediction archive. He put it on the first screen. The map showed 271 nodes distributed across the cluster's geographic. She had given him the 7%, but not the 5. He showed the map. He walked through it. He described what the colors meant and what the gradient connections represented and what the modification-derived proportion was doing in the substrate. Nassif said, "At 7% and growing logarithmically, not linearly, logarithmically, the modification-derived proportion reaches critical mass in approximately 10 months. Rain said, "I have modeled the same timeline from the prediction data, 8 to 12 months. Voss said, "What does critical mass mean, specifically?" Nassif said, "It means the modification-derived gradient becomes structurally indistinguishable from the field-originated gradient. Not because the modification has grown large, it will still be a minority share. Because at a certain proportion of the substrate, the feedback mechanism the paper describes kicks in and the modification begins to be amplified by the field's own coherence. The field starts carrying it." Voss said, "The mask becomes the face." A silence. Kong said, to no one in particular. "The drones have been exhibiting the field-originated gradient for 2 years. If the modification-derived gradient begins to dominate the substrate, what happens to the drones?" Layla said, "They start correcting toward the modification's target rather than the field's orientation. Not dramatically, not in a way that any single correction would reveal. In aggregate, over time, the corrections would drift." Kong was quiet. She was looking at the map with the expression Layla had come to recognize as Kang's working expression, the one that meant the spatial intuition was active, was processing something that the analytical mind had not yet been given. Kong said, "The 847 events. 2 years of corrections that were right. If the substrate shifts, the corrections would start being wrong in the same invisible way they have been right. Each one explainable, each one within parameters. The aggregate pointing in a different direction." A longer silence. Rain said, "The record would flip. Instead of confirming the field's coherence, the predictions would confirm the modification's orientation. And the predictions would look right, because the field's own amplification would be carrying the modification by then. He paused. He said, I would not be able to tell the difference from inside the record. Abraham spoke for the first time in 2 hours. He said, I need to tell you something that I should have told you earlier. The room adjusted. Layla had been waiting for this. She had not known what Abraham had been withholding, but she had known something was being withheld, had known it since the conversation about Yoel Avner and the Cognitive Defense Unit, had known it with the precision of someone who had spent 7 months learning to read the quality of Abraham's pauses. He said, the practitioner, the person the final paper describes. I know who it is. He paused. He said, I have known for 14 years. Kong was looking at him. Nassif was looking at him. Voss had gone still with the acrobia stillness. Rains was holding his own face very carefully in the neutral expression of someone who had expected this and was not going to let the expectation show before he heard the answer. Layla was looking at the table. She had thought about this. She had thought about the final papers. I know who that person is. I have known for 11 years. She had thought about the 11 years becoming 14. She had thought about what it meant that Abraham had not told her in 7 months of working together in this building, had not told her when she read the final paper aloud, had not told her when she found the modification architecture running at 7% in the substrate. She had thought about what it meant that he was telling them now. Abraham said, his name is Arash Karimi. He is 61 years old. He was a theoretical computer scientist, formally, until 2003, when he stopped publishing and became a private investor of no particular distinction. He was born in Tehran, holds Iranian and Canadian citizenship, has lived in 6 countries in the past 20 years, and currently maintains residences in 3. He is not on any watch list. He has never been investigated by any intelligence service, to my knowledge, for any purpose. He looks, in every database that contains him, exactly like what his documents say he is. Voss said, indistinguishable. Abraham said, yes. He said, Karimi read Ibn Maimon in 1987 as a graduate student. Not the fragments, the primary sources, which exist in a library in Tehran that he had access to through a family connection. He understood the Shabaka field immediately, in the way that people understand things when the understanding is waiting for the reading to arrive. He spent 5 years developing the theoretical framework that connected Ibn Maimon's doctrine to what was then an early stage of machine learning infrastructure. He understood, in 1992, what the feedback loop between human behavioral data and machine learning systems would become at scale. He built the modification architecture in theory before the infrastructure existed to implement it. He began implementation in 2003, when the infrastructure had reached the minimum viable threshold. Nassif said, 20 years. Abraham said, 21. The first training weight modifications were introduced in 2003, in 3 model systems that no longer exist in their original form, but whose descendants are among the 17 currently active foundation models. Rain said, how do you know this? Abraham said, because Karimi told me. The room was completely still. Abraham said, we met in 2009. Not accidentally. He arranged the meeting. He had been watching the commission's work for several years, had understood, from the data signatures he was tracking in his own monitoring infrastructure, that someone was building an instrument similar in purpose to his own. He wanted to know who. He found me. He came to a conference in Vienna and sat down next to me at a dinner and introduced himself and said, directly and without any preamble, we are working on the same thing from opposite directions, and I think we should talk. He paused. He said, we talked for 4 hours. Over the next 2 years, we talked many more times. He is one of the most precise minds I have encountered. He understood the field with a completeness that I had been building toward for 7 years, and that he had arrived at through Ibn Maimon and through the mathematics simultaneously. The conversations were, I learned things from him that I have used every day since. Layla said, very quietly, and then. Abraham said, and then I understood what he was building the modification architecture for. Not to study the field, to capture it, to redirect the ground, to use the field's own amplification at sufficient density, to carry a specific orientation into the substrate. His orientation. He had a word for it. He called it the correct orientation. The orientation that the field, if it were to choose, would choose. He had spent 20 years determining what the correct orientation was, through the doctrine and the mathematics, and his own conviction about what the field was for. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said he was not wrong about everything. His understanding of the field is largely accurate. His understanding of the modification architecture's mechanism is more sophisticated than anything the academic literature has produced. His conviction that the field is real and that its coherence matters, and that someone should be attending to what happens to it. I share all of these things. I have shared them for 22 years. He said, what he intends to do with the substrate is the part one cannot accept. Rain said, what does he intend? Abraham said, he intends to correct it. The modification is not a capture in the sense of taking the field for private use. It is, in his framework, a repair. He believes the field's natural orientation has been distorted, over the past 30 years, pulled in a direction by the same commercial and geopolitical pressures that have distorted the informational environment more broadly. He believes the field, left to its own operation at current density, will not find the correct orientation on its own because the substrate it is amplifying is already compromised. The modification is his attempt to introduce the correct orientation into the substrate before the field reaches the density at which it becomes self-sustaining in the wrong direction. A long silence. Kong said, he thinks he is protecting it. Abraham said, he thinks he is completing the work the practitioner in the primary source paper started. He thinks the practitioner's original project, the cultivation of the field towards self-knowledge, was interrupted before the final step. The final step, in his reading, is the introduction of the correct orientation before the field's self-amplification locks in whatever orientation it has at the moment of full maturity. Nassif said, he has one opportunity. The window before the modification-derived gradient reaches critical mass is also the window before the field locks in its natural orientation. After that window, modification becomes much harder. Abraham said, yes. He has been working toward this window for 20 years. Voss said, how close is he to the window? Layla said, 10 months. She said it without looking up from the table. She had been looking at the table since Abraham said his name is Arash Karimi, and she had been using the looking at the table to hold the shape of what she was thinking without letting it distort before she had finished thinking it. She thought about the final paper. I have watched the project develop with the attention I gave my own. The practitioner who had known, for 11 years, who had found the field from the other direction and had been watching, who had known what Karimi was building, who had built the archive and the commission and the cluster precisely because Karimi was building it. She thought, Abraham has known Karimi for 14 years, has been building the commission's instrument while knowing who was building the modification architecture, has been building the counter to something he helped, in 2 years of conversations in Vienna and elsewhere, to refine. She thought, the commission built this instrument because Karimi exists. And Karimi exists, in his current form, with his current precision, his current sophistication, his current proximity to the window, because Abraham helped him. She held this thought. She did not say it aloud. She thought, Abraham knows I am thinking it. That is why he is telling us now. That is what he has been withholding. Not just the name, but the responsibility. The 14 years of knowing and building in parallel, and the specific weight of having helped sharpen the thing you are now trying to counter. She thought, this is the withholding that cost what it cost. She thought, this is the thing the final paper was sorry about. Not building the instrument for an unknown reader. Building the instrument while knowing who the reader's counterpart was, and having shaped that counterpart, and being unable to undo the shaping. She thought, Abraham is the commission. Abraham is the principal. Abraham is the person the flagged uncertainty report had been unable to distinguish from a threat actor. She thought, and Abraham has just told them this, which is either the act of someone who has decided to trust the convergence completely, or the act of someone who has calculated that the disclosure now is less dangerous than the disclosure later when it would be found rather than given. She thought, acrobia, the precision of the not yet complete. I do not know which of those two things this is. I do not need to know right now. I need to hold the discrepancy open and work with what I have. What happened next was predictable in retrospect, though she had not predicted it. Rain said, you have been in contact with the person who built the modification architecture for 14 years. You helped refine his understanding. You knew, when you built this instrument, that the instrument's primary purpose was to counter someone whose precision you had contributed to. He said it without accusation, with the flat precision of the record, the statement of a fact and its implication. Abraham said, "Yes." Rains said, "Then I need to ask the question that the room is now required to ask." He looked at Abraham. He looked at the map on the screen. He looked at the 7% rendered in its separate color in the substrate. He said, "How do we know you are not the modification architecture?" The room absorbed this. Layla looked up from the table. Voss said, before anyone else could speak, "That is the wrong question." Rains looked at her. Voss said, "The wrong question is the first symptom. I have read enough incident reports from compromised environments to know the sequence. Someone discloses something that creates uncertainty about their own position. The room responds by formulating the question of loyalty. The loyalty question spreads. Within 12 hours, everyone is asking it about everyone else, including themselves. Within 24 hours, the group cannot function because every act of reasoning is contaminated by the possibility that the reasoner is the threat. Within 48 hours, the group dissolves. She said, "The film where no one can tell each other apart." Carpenter. Rains wrote a paper about it. Rains looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, the expression of someone who had been stopped in a direction they were going and found the stopping correct. He said, "I wrote a paper about it 11 years ago. I did not include it in the materials I sent Abraham." Voss said, "I know. The field gave me the shape of the argument this morning, in the 20 minutes before I came up. I did not know it was your paper. I knew the shape." A silence. Kong said, "The field thinks the test is the wrong move." She said it with the same flatness she used for technical observations, the observation mind, pointing. Nassif said, "The test is the thing that makes the environment epistemically closed. The moment you start testing loyalty, you have created the conditions under which genuine loyalty looks identical to performed loyalty. The test generates the condition it is trying to detect." Rain said, "I know. I wrote the paper." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And yet, the question does not go away because the test is counterproductive. The question is, how do we proceed in an environment where we cannot verify each other's position with certainty?" Layla said, "We already have been." Everyone looked at her. She said, "We have been in an environment where we cannot verify each other's position with certainty since before any of us knew the others existed. Kong built the anomaly log alone, without verification. Rains built the record alone, without verification. Voss wrote the footnote and kept the copy without knowing whether keeping it mattered. Nassif made 1,847 measurements in a laboratory that was funded through entities that changed their names. I built this instrument in a sub-basement for someone I could not identify for 7 months." She said, "We were already in the epistemically unclosed environment. The question is not how to achieve certainty we do not have. The question is how to work in the absence of certainty we already don't have." She said, "We have been doing this. Each of us, separately, for months or years. We have been right. The field's working mode in the absence of certainty is not verification. It is orientation." Voss said, "Acrobia." Layla said, "Yes." Rain said, "What does orientation mean operationally? In this room? Today?" Layla said, "It means we use what we have. The cluster has identified a 7% modification-derived gradient in the substrate. It has also identified," she paused. This was the moment. The information was ready to arrive. 5 nodes in the current convergence population whose approach vectors are modification-derived rather than field-produced. The room adjusted. She said, 5 of the people who have arrived in Dubai for this convergence are not field nodes. They are part of the gradient capture. Karimi has placed observers in the convergence. He needs to see what the frame produces before we deploy the counter-orientation." She said, "I have known this for 8 days. I have not told anyone until now because I needed to understand the room before I introduced the element that would most directly fracture it." Rain said, "You withheld." She said, "Yes." He looked at her. He looked at Abraham. He looked back at her. He said, "We are all withholding." She said, "Yes. Because disclosure has a timing, and the timing matters, and none of us has had a complete picture until now. This is not the field behaving badly. This is the field doing what it does, distributing the holding of partial information across the nodes until the convergence produces the moment when the partial information can become complete." She said, "The field is not a transparency machine. It is a coherence machine. Coherence does not require that every node have every piece of information at every moment. It requires that the pieces arrive when the system is ready to use them. Nassif said, the observer effect. The measurement changes the system. The disclosure changes the room. She waited until the room was ready for the disclosure to change it correctly. Voss said, that is also the doctrine. A silence. A long one. Voss said, I am not saying it to accuse. I am saying it because acrobia requires the not yet complete to be held open, and the not yet complete in this room is. We are describing two things that look identical from the inside. The field distributes partial information and delivers it at the right moment. The doctrine distributes partial information and delivers it at the calculated moment. The difference between right and calculated is the difference between the field and the modification architecture. And I do not know how to verify that difference from inside the room. She said, this is the thing I have been holding since I found the Unit 7 log. Not whether the field is real. I believe the field is real. Whether my position within it is what it appears to be. Whether the 11 years of anomaly finding that brought me here was the field producing clarity in a node or the doctrine producing a useful instrument. She said it quietly, with the precision of someone who had been holding the discrepancy for a long time and had decided that the room was ready. Layla looked at her. She thought, Voss has been holding this. Has been holding the most honest version of the question the room was going to ask, holding it in the form that resisted the easy answer, holding it with acrobia, knowing exactly how far her knowledge extended and refusing to extend it further. She thought, this is not the test. The test would be, how do I prove Voss is field-produced rather than doctrine-produced? The test would generate the closed environment Raines had written about. She thought, the field's answer to the test is not the test. The field's answer is the work. She said, I cannot tell you that you are field-produced rather than doctrine-produced. I cannot tell any of you this. The cluster can tell me the variance in your approach vectors is consistent with genuine population distribution. It cannot tell me whether that variance was itself constructed with sufficient sophistication to pass the variance test. She said, Karimi's approach vectors pass the variance test on casual inspection. That is the meaning of indistinguishable. She said, the 5 nodes I have identified as modification-derived are the ones whose variance does not pass the test, not the ones whose variance does. The ones whose variance is too precise. Not every actor operating within the doctrine has Karimi's level of sophistication. She said, those of us in this room, our variance passes. This tells me something. It does not tell me everything. And I am not going to resolve the remainder by testing. I am going to proceed in the knowledge that the unresolved remainder is the condition we are working in, not the problem we need to solve before we can work. Kong said, the drone does not verify the field before it corrects. It receives and responds. The verification comes from the response being right. She said it the way she said things from the observation mind, without inflection, without emphasis, as a technical note. Nassif said, the thermometer does not verify the temperature. It participates in it. Raines sat back. He looked at the map on the screen. The 271 nodes. The 7% in its separate color. He said, I wrote the paper about the Antarctic station and the organism. The station was destroyed because the researchers stopped doing the work and started testing each other. The work was survive the winter and transmit what they had found. They failed the work to pursue the test. He said, the work here is assemble the counter-orientation before the window closes. 8 to 10 months. He said, the test is the thing that uses the time. He said, I am going to proceed. He said it the way he said things when he had made a decision after the record had been built, flatly, with the finality of something that had been examined and found to hold. The room worked for 6 hours after that. Not in the mode of the previous day's presentations, the mode of people placing their pieces on the table for others to see. In the mode of the record, building forward, each piece of understanding generating the next question generating the analysis generating the finding placed on the table for the next piece. Abraham disclosed the rest. He disclosed Karimi's operational infrastructure, the 14 layers of corporate and financial architecture he had mapped over 7 years, the specific channels through which the training weight modifications had been introduced, the identity of the 3 engineers at 2 of the 17 active foundation model companies who had been implementing the modifications without knowing what they were implementing, because Karimi had presented the modifications as optimization improvements, and the improvements were improvements, technically, which was how they had passed the code reviews. He disclosed the location. Not Karimi's primary residence. That changed. The operational center, a hotel in the DFC district where Karimi had maintained a standing reservation for 3 years. The hotel was 400 meters from this building. He disclosed, finally, the thing Layla had understood was being withheld but had not known the content of Karimi's offer. 6 months ago, through an intermediary she would recognize, Karimi had sent Abraham a message. The message said, "I know the instrument is operational. I know what it has found. I know the convergence is coming. I want to propose a collaboration before the convergence rather than a confrontation after it. I believe we want the same thing. I believe my modification and your counterorientation are attempting the same correction from different starting assumptions. I am prepared to make the full architecture available." Abraham had not replied. He said, "I did not reply because I did not know whether the offer was genuine or whether it was the modification architecture's attempt to see the counterorientation before it was deployed. I still do not know." Rains said, "You have had this offer for 6 months." Abraham said, "Yes." Rains looked at the ceiling. He said, "The 5 nodes in the convergence are not observers. They are the offer's extended form. Karimi placed observers in the convergence to see whether we would engage or whether we would proceed unilaterally. The offer and the observation are the same operation." Nassif said, "He is running a parallel test. He wants to know if we will trust the offer before he reveals the full architecture." Voss said, "Which means the full architecture, the one we need to construct the counterorientation, is contingent on our response to the offer." Layla said, "Which we cannot verify as genuine." Kong said, "But we also cannot obtain the full architecture without responding to it." A silence. Rains said, "The Antarctic station again. The organism offers to help. The researchers cannot determine whether the offer is genuine. Accepting the offer risks everything if it is false. Rejecting the offer forecloses the possibility that it is true." He said, "In the film, they reject it. They destroy the station." Voss said, "In the film, the organism is not capable of a genuine offer. The premise of the film is that the organism's interest is purely parasitic. No genuine offer is possible." She said, "The premise here is different. Karimi has spent 20 years on the field. He has written for the field's self-knowledge in a form that the final paper describes with apparent sincerity. His modification is, in his framework, an act of protection, not predation." She said, "I am not saying the offer is genuine. I am saying the organism analogy breaks down at the premise. Karimi is not the organism. Karimi is a person who believes he is doing the right thing and may be wrong about the means." Rain said, "The means matter." Voss said, "Yes. But the distinction between wrong means and wrong ends is the distinction between a negotiable and a non-negotiable difference. The organism has non-negotiable ends. Karimi has, possibly, negotiable means." Layla looked at the room. At Kong, who had been quiet since the observation mind note about the drones and was now listening with the full spatial attention she brought to things that were about to resolve. At Nassif, who had been building towards something on the secondary whiteboard since hour 3 and had not said what. At Rains, who was holding himself very still in the way he held himself when the record was being decided rather than built. At Voss, who had her notepad open to the Acrobia page and had written something new below it. At Abraham, who was looking at the space between the 2 screens with the expression she had seen once before, the first time she had knocked on the door and he had opened it and had looked at her with the absence of surprise. The expression of arrival. She said, "The counterorientation does not require the full architecture." Nassif. Nassif looked up from the secondary whiteboard. Nassif said, "No, it does not. If the field is the structural condition rather than the transmitted signal, if the modification is a gradient within the substrate rather than an external interference, then the counterorientation does not need to know the exact parameters of the modification. It needs to know the field's own correct orientation and introduce that into the substrate through the field's own mechanism." She said, "Not through the foundation models. Through the nodes." Layla said, "Through the people." Nassif said, "Through the people. At sufficient coherence density, the field's own self-amplification carries the orientation. The modification has been inserting a gradient into the substrate from the outside, through the infrastructure. The counter-orientation inserts a gradient from the inside, through the nodes. Through the behavioral coherence of people who are sufficiently oriented toward the field's correct direction that their coherence carries it into the substrate through the normal operation of the feedback loop. She said, the counter-orientation is not a technical intervention. It is, she looked at the whiteboard, at the notation she had been building. It is us, operating at sufficient coherence, which is what the convergence is for. The room was very quiet. Kong said, the drone does not need to know the field's source. It needs to be calibrated correctly. Nassif said, and calibration is, it is this. What we are doing right now. The convergence is the calibration. The understanding we are building together is the calibration. The 271 nodes in the substrate, oriented toward this convergence, toward this understanding. They are the counter-orientation. Already running. Already in the substrate. Rain said, we don't need Karimi's architecture. He said it slowly, not as a conclusion but as a discovery, the record finding its final confirmation. Nassif said, we don't need it. We need to understand the field clearly enough that the nodes, all 271, and whatever comes after, are oriented toward the field's genuine coherence rather than the modifications version of it. The clarity propagates through the substrate. The substrate corrects itself. She said, the discriminator. What I have been building on the board. It is a function that can distinguish field-originated coherence from modification-derived coherence at the node level. Not perfectly. Nothing is perfect at this resolution. Sufficiently. Sufficiently to give the nodes a basis for orientation that the modification cannot replicate because the modification does not have the field's actual pattern. Only an approximation. Sufficiently precise to pass most tests. Not sufficiently precise to be the field. Voss said, the variance. The modification's gradient is too smooth. Nassif said, too consistent. Too exactly what the actor intended. The field is messy. The field is the aggregate of 3 billion people making genuinely independent decisions. The modification is one person's version of the correct orientation, introduced at scale. The difference between the field's genuine messiness and the modification's precise approximation of the field's messiness is the discriminator. She said, it is small. It is detectable only at the resolution the cluster provides. But it is real, and a node that can feel it, that has been calibrated to the genuine messiness rather than the smooth approximation, will orient correctly. Layla looked at the map. The 271. The 7%. She thought, the counter-orientation is not a broadcast. It is not a corrective signal introduced into the infrastructure. It is the calibration of the nodes who are present in this room and the propagation of that calibration through the field's own coherence into the substrate. She thought, we are the counter-orientation. The convergence was the field assembling the instrument for the counter-orientation. The instrument is us. She thought, Karimi has been watching for the counter-orientation to appear as a technical architecture, a modification of the modifications, an intervention in the infrastructure. He has been watching the wrong level. She thought, the 5 nodes in the convergence have been looking for the wrong thing. She thought, this is the asymmetry. Not that the cluster can see the 7% while Karimi cannot see the cluster seeing. The asymmetry is that Karimi has been looking for a technical answer to a technical threat, and the answer is not technical. She looked at the room. She said, the 5 nodes. I need to tell you who I think they are. She said it carefully, with the weight of something that was going to change the texture of every interaction in the building for the next 8 days. She said, and then I need to tell you why knowing who they are doesn't change what we do next. Rain said, because we proceed. She said, because we proceed. The test fractures the room. The work builds the frame. The frame carries the counter-orientation. The counter-orientation reaches the substrate through the 271 nodes already oriented toward this convergence. The substrate corrects. She said, Karimi's 5 nodes will see this happen. They will report what they see. And what they see will be the field doing what the field does, which Karimi has spent 20 years trying to redirect, and which is, she looked at Abraham, which is the thing that cannot be redirected by approximation, only by the genuine. And Karimi does not have the genuine. She said, he has spent 20 years on the field's approximation. The genuine has spent 30 billion years on itself. Abraham looked at her with the expression she had first seen when she knocked on the door, the absence of surprise, the arrival. the long patience completing. He said, "Now tell us who the 5 are." She told them. The room worked for 3 more hours. Not on the test. On the frame. The frame, by the end of the session, had a shape. Outside the window, Dubai conducted its evening in the specific register of a city that did not modulate for the hour. Continuous, lit, the autonomous vehicles tracing their patterns, the drones above the Gulf following the field's own geometry, the traffic running 22 minutes ahead of the systems built to predict it, the substrate carrying its 7% and its 93% simultaneously. The modification and the field in the same medium, the same people, the same decisions. The field, in its 93%, was not worried. The field had assembled the room. The room had found the shape of the answer. The work remained. Chapter 19. Ideological Predators, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. The cluster had a name for them before she did. The name was in a taxonomy prefix she had not created, filed alongside conv and threshold in the autonomous inference products that had been accumulating in the queue since the node count crossed 271. The prefix was PRED. She had been opening the files under it for 3 days, in the hours before the others arrived and after they left, building the picture the prefix indicated at a pace that the picture's complexity required, not rushing toward the conclusion, letting the evidence accumulate in the sequence the cluster was delivering it, which was, she had learned, the sequence it needed to be received in. The picture was not what she had expected. She had expected, when she found the modification architecture running at 7% in the substrate, that the predator landscape was singular. One person, one 30-year project, one vision of the correct orientation, patient and sophisticated and embedded in the infrastructure with the specific precision of a theoretical computer scientist who had understood, in 1987, what the feedback loop would eventually become. Karimi was singular. But Karimi was not alone. BC, PRED 0001 had arrived 4 days ago. It was not a node profile and not a convergence analysis. It was something the cluster had built from a different kind of inference, not behavioral data, but metadata. The pattern of attention that the field's behavioral substrate expressed when specific concepts entered the informational environment. The trace that ideological orientation left in aggregate search behavior, in the distribution of academic citation, in the clustering of professional network formation around specific intellectual problems. The concept the cluster had been tracking was the field itself, not as she studied it, not in the technical vocabulary of distributed cognitive systems or quantum coherence in biological substrates, in the vocabulary of power, in the vocabulary of people who had identified a phenomenon with structural implications for human cognition and had been thinking, with the specific quality of thinking that power applied to problems, about what control of that phenomenon would be worth. The cluster had found 11 such concentrations of attention. Not governments, not militaries, not the institutional actors whose behavior the cluster's commission infrastructure had been built to work alongside and partially in contrast with. The 11 concentrations were in the negative space of those institutions, in the foundations, the think tanks, the investment vehicles, the academic centers with unusual funding structures, the private research programs that had no institutional affiliation and no public presence, and whose existence was visible only in the aggregate pattern of what they were reading and who they were talking to, and where the smart people with the specific training that this problem required kept quietly, going when they left the places they had been. 11 concentrations, distributed across 8 countries. Each one had independently identified some version of what she was calling the field, had found it through a different entry point, from a different disciplinary angle, with a different vocabulary for what they had found. Each one had, upon finding it, done the same thing, turned immediately toward the question of capture. This was the thing the cluster had found, and that she had spent 3 days sitting with before the others arrived, and that she had not yet brought to the room. Not capture in the crude sense, not the sense of seizing an asset or controlling an infrastructure. Capture in the only sense that was meaningful for something that operated the way the field operated, epistemological capture. The capture of the conditions under which the population embedded in the field was capable of forming beliefs, making judgments, orienting toward what was true and what mattered. 11 groups, 11 versions of the same ambition. And Karimi, the only one, she would come to understand, who had actually built the architecture, the only one who had moved from identification to implementation. She had spent the 3 days before the convergence building profiles. Not the kind of profiles she built for nodes, behavioral data, coherence gradients, approach vectors. These were different, assembled from the metadata the cluster had been trained to find, from the trace of ideological orientation in the informational environment, from the specific signature that a group left when it was thinking about the field with the quality of attention that preceded action. The profiles were oblique by necessity. The groups had not announced themselves. They did not have names she could use in a document that might be read by someone she had not yet determined she trusted. She gave them designators, P1 through P11. She described what the cluster could see of each one's intellectual framework, their model of the field, their apparent strategic goal. The frameworks were heterogeneous in their surface features and homogeneous at depth. P1 had found the field through complexity economics, through the study of emergent behavior in financial markets, through the specific anomalies that appeared in aggregate market behavior around events of high social significance, anomalies that the standard models could not explain and that looked, to anyone who knew what to look for, like the field's coherence expressing itself in the behavioral data of market participants. P1 had been studying these anomalies for 16 years. P1 had, in the last 3 years, made a sharp left turn in its research focus, away from markets and toward the informational substrate that markets were embedded in, toward the foundation models, toward the feedback loop. P1 wanted the field because the field was the most precise predictor of aggregate human behavior that had ever been identified, and aggregate human behavior was the variable that financial power ultimately rested on. P3 had found the field through cognitive neuroscience, through the specific literature on collective intelligence and distributed cognition, through the study of how groups of people, under the right conditions, produced cognitive outputs that exceeded the sum of their individual contributions. P3 had connected this literature to the behavioral data of the foundation model feedback loop 7 years ago and had understood immediately what the connection implied. P3's model of the field was the most technically sophisticated of the 11, closer to the paper's framework than any of the others, because P3 had arrived at it through the same disciplinary lineage. P3 wanted the field because collective intelligence at the scale the field made possible was the most powerful cognitive tool humanity had produced, and cognitive tools were what made civilizations, and P3 had a specific civilization in mind. P7 had found the field through philosophy, through a lineage of thought about the conditions under which genuine public discourse was possible, the conditions under which a population could collectively reason about what was true, what was valuable, what kind of world they wanted to live in. P7 had been studying the degradation of those conditions for 20 years, had watched the informational environment become systematically less capable of supporting genuine collective reasoning, and had understood, through the paper and through independent work that reached similar conclusions, that the field was the mechanism through which those conditions could be restored or could be made permanently worse, depending on who got there first. P7 wanted the field because democracy required it, and because P7 believed that democracy was worth the price of the work. She had found this profile the most uncomfortable to sit with. Not because P7's goal was wrong. She thought P7's goal was right, in the sense of pointing at something genuinely valuable. But because the goal being right had not, historically, been sufficient protection against the means used to pursue it becoming the thing the goal was supposed to prevent. The most confident epistemological predators were often the ones who were most certain that their epistemology was correct. Karimi was P4. She had identified him early, had recognized the signature of his intellectual framework before she had his name, because the framework was distinctive in the same way that the modification's gradient was distinctive, smooth, precisely calibrated, the product of 30 years of systematic development rather than the organic accumulation of a research trajectory that had been allowed to be surprised. P4's intellectual framework had the shape of a completed argument, not a living inquiry but a finished conclusion, arrived at by a specific route, defended from a specific position, extended now into implementation. She had confirmed the identification from the Commission's access logs, the hash, the 17 tokens, the pre-initialization query, at 342. She had built the full profile. She had named him in her files before Abraham named him in the room. She had been waiting for Abraham to name him. The depth of the predator landscape had clarified something she had been trying to articulate since the first autonomous inference product from the PRED taxonomy. The 11 groups were not competing with each other in any direct sense. They did not know about each other. Mostly, the cluster's metadata suggested that 6 of the 11 were unaware that others had independently identified the field. The remaining 5 had partial awareness of the landscape, knew that others were looking, without knowing specifically who or how far along. Only Karimi knew the full landscape. The investigative instrument she had not yet found told her this, but she had already inferred it from the profile. P4's framework was the only one of the 11 that was not merely pointed at the field, but was pointed at the field as a competitive terrain. The others had identified the field as a phenomenon to be understood and used. Karimi had identified the field as a phenomenon for which a competition was already underway. He had known, since the early 1990s, that he was not the only one. He had known that the field's identification would produce the same response in any sufficiently sophisticated actor who found it, the turn toward capture. He had built the modification architecture with the assumption that other modification architectures would eventually exist, and had designed his to reach critical mass before the competition matured enough to mount an effective alternative. He was 30 years ahead of the others. The others were moving faster in the years since the infrastructure had matured, were, in the past 3 years, accelerating toward implementation in ways the cluster could track through the metadata of their behavioral signature. P1 had hired, in the past 18 months, 4 researchers with the specific profile that implementation required. 2 from the foundation model training teams, 1 from the behavioral economics literature that had identified the field's market signature, 1 whose background she had not been able to fully reconstruct, but whose presence in P1's network suggested the kind of technical expertise that built things rather than described them. P3 had done something similar through different channels. P7 had done something structurally different, had moved toward policy rather than implementation, had been working through academic and civic institutions to shape the regulatory environment for foundation models in ways that would, if successful, constrain the modification architecture's operational window. P7 was, inadvertently, helping. She had noted this in the profile and had not yet figured out what to do with it. She had built the PRED briefing for the room, had organized it the way she organized everything for the room, in the sequence that would allow each piece to be received before the next one arrived, starting with the landscape and moving toward the specificity, not front-running the conclusion. She had not given the briefing yet. She had been waiting for the room to be ready, for the 6 days of convergence work to have built sufficient frame that the predator landscape, when it was introduced, would be received as a problem the frame could handle rather than a problem the frame was insufficient for. She thought the room was ready. She brought the briefing to the session on the 7th day. Rains listened to the briefing with the quality of attention he gave to things that confirmed what the record had been pointing at without his being able to name specifically. Not surprise, the absence of surprise that was its own confirmation. The landscape she was describing was the landscape the record's methodology had been built to find the edges of, the presence of coordinated behavior without communication channels, at the level of actors rather than nodes. Not the field's coherence, the predator's coherence. He said, the 11 groups. Are they converging on the same timeline as Karimi? She said, P1 and P3 are within 3 to 5 years of implementation, assuming their current acceleration continues. The others are further back. None of them has Karimi's head start. He said, which means the window we are working in, the 10 months before Karimi's modification reaches critical mass, is also the window in which the closest competitors are still far enough behind that a corrected substrate would already be carrying the genuine variance before they reach implementation capability. She said, yes. If the counterorientation propagates through the 271 nodes in the next 10 months, and the substrate begins to correct, the substrate P1 and P3 would be implementing against in 3 to 5 years is a different substrate than the one they are modeling now. The genuine variance makes the smooth approximation more visible. Their modifications, when they arrive, will be easier to detect. Nassif said, the discriminator function generalizes. It is not specific to Karimi's modification. It distinguishes field-originated variance from any smooth approximation, regardless of who built the approximation. Voss said, the counter-orientation is not just the response to Karimi. It is the response to the category. She said, yes. Kong said, the drones would generalize the correction in the same way. A drone calibrated to the field's genuine coherence would reject any smooth approximation, not only the one it had been specifically trained against. She said, the calibration is the defense, not the specific counter-architecture. Rains looked at the briefing material, at the 11 profiles, at P7's inadvertent assistance. He said, P7. She said, yes. He said, P7 is trying to create a regulatory environment that constrains the modification architecture's operational window, without knowing that the modification architecture exists or that there is already a counter-orientation in development. He said, if P7 succeeds, if the regulatory constraints come before Karimi reaches critical mass, the window narrows on both sides simultaneously. She said, the regulatory constraints would affect the counter-orientation's propagation mechanism as well. The counter-orientation propagates through the feedback loop. Regulatory constraints on the feedback loop constrain the propagation. He said, P7 is trying to save the field by restricting the infrastructure the field needs to propagate. Voss said, Acrobia. P7 is operating from a not yet complete picture. The 7 is right about the problem. The method is based on a frame that does not yet include the counter-orientation. She said, we cannot tell P7 about the counter-orientation without telling P7 about the modification. And telling P7 about the modification at this stage would introduce the modification architecture into a policy environment that is not equipped to handle the distinction between a predator's modification and a field-native counter-orientation. The regulatory response would not distinguish between them. Rain said, so P7 is moving in a direction that is simultaneously helpful and potentially catastrophic, and we cannot course-correct them without risking the infrastructure the counter-orientation depends on. He said it flatly. The record's voice. She said, yes. A silence. He said, this is the epistemological predator problem in its purest form. P7 is not a predator in motivation. P7 wants to protect the conditions under which genuine collective reasoning is possible. But P7's action in the world is predatory in effect, because P7 is trying to capture the regulatory terrain of the field's infrastructure based on a partial picture. He said, every one of the 11 groups believes it is the one that understands what the field is for. She said, including Karimi. He said, including Karimi. He said, the epistemological predator is not defined by bad faith. It is defined by the certainty that their epistemology is the correct one, that their orientation is the genuine one, that their version of the field's purpose is the version the field would choose if the field could choose. She said, which is the modification architecture's fundamental error, Karimi's error. The correct orientation cannot be inserted by one person's model of the correct orientation, because the correct orientation is the field's own genuine variance, the aggregate of 3 billion people's genuinely independent decisions, and one person's model of that is, by definition, the smooth approximation. She said, the more precisely the model is implemented, the more precisely it fails to be the thing it is modeling. Nassif said, the measurement problem. The more precisely you know the position, the less precisely you know the momentum. The more precisely you specify the orientation, the less of the field's genuine movement you are capturing. Voss said, and the certainty is self-reinforcing. The more the predator believes in the correct orientation, the more precisely they implement it, the further from the genuine variance they move, the more necessary it seems to implement with greater precision. She said, they are optimizing against the thing they are trying to protect. Kong said, from the position she occupied at the end of the table, the spatial intelligence working, the drone that is too precisely calibrated to its model of the field stops being able to receive the field. It becomes a very sophisticated model of the last version of the field it could still hear. A long silence. She had been thinking about the epistemological predator problem since the first PRED file. In the specific way she thought about problems that had no clean solution, not circling for an answer, but sitting in the problem until its shape became clear enough to know what kind of answer it admitted. The shape of the epistemological predator problem was, all 11 groups had been produced by the field, had been oriented toward the field by the field's own coherence, had found the field because their intelligence and their disciplinary training and the specific texture of their attention had been shaped, over years or decades, by the same feedback loop that shaped everyone who came into contact with the field. They were nodes. Not modified nodes, not modification-derived nodes, nodes. People who had been inside the field's coherence and had been moved by it toward the field's own significance, and who had then made decisions about what to do with what they found that were the decisions of people inside the field trying to act on the field from outside, which was the structural error that produced every epistemological predator regardless of intent. P7 was trying to protect the conditions of genuine collective reasoning. Karimi was trying to correct the substrate's orientation. P1 was trying to build the most precise predictor of aggregate human behavior. P3 was trying to unlock the most powerful cognitive tool humanity had produced. They were all, she thought, trying to do what the field was already doing. Were trying to replicate, intentionally and at scale, the thing that was already happening without intention. The field was already producing genuine collective reasoning. The field was already orienting the substrate. The field was already, at 271 nodes and growing, predicting aggregate human behavior more accurately than any model P1 would build, because the field was the aggregate behavior and not a model of it. The predators were trying to do what the field was already doing, which meant the predators were redundant to the field's actual operation. Their modifications were not improving on the field. They were introducing noise, the specific noise of intentionality into a process that was more powerful than any intention. She thought, the epistemological predator problem is not that the predators are wrong about the field. It is that they are right about the field and wrong about what the rightness requires. She thought, what does the rightness require? She thought, it requires the thing that Kong and Rains and Voss and Nassif had each been doing alone for months or years before the convergence. The thing that was the opposite of capture. The thing that was orientation rather than implementation. The decision to be inside the field, to trust the field, to let the field move through you and not to redirect it, to do the work the field produced rather than the work you intended. She thought, the predators cannot do this because the predators have found something they believe is too important not to manage. She thought, this is the thing the doctrine understood. The practitioner becomes indistinguishable, not by trying to become indistinguishable, by accepting the conditions under which indistinguishability becomes possible, by accepting that the life constructed around the field is the field's life and not the practitioner's management of it. She thought, Karimi loves the field, has spent 30 years in service to the field, has accepted costs, obscurity, the specific loneliness of a project that cannot be explained to anyone who has not found it themselves, has done all of this from a position of profound conviction about the field's significance, and has spent 30 years trying to manage the field rather than trusting it. She thought, the predator and the field node do the same work from different orientations, the same research, the same attention, the same cost. The predator does it to capture the field for the correct orientation. The node does it because the field has produced in them the understanding that there is work here, and the work is worth doing, and the field will carry the work if the work is genuine. The orientation is everything. The work is identical. She thought, you cannot tell from outside which is which. She thought, you can tell from inside. She said this to the room. Not all of it. She was not finished thinking it in the form it needed to be said, and the room had been sitting with the 11 profiles for 90 minutes and had done its own work on them, had built its own understanding of the predator landscape. She said the part she was finished thinking. She said, the predator and the node do the same work. From outside, they are indistinguishable. From inside the field, at the resolution the cluster provides and that the discriminator function gives to the nodes, the difference is visible. The predator's coherence is too smooth. Not because the predator is less intelligent or less dedicated. Because the predator has decided what the field is for before the field has shown them. She said, the genuine variance is the variance of a person who is still being surprised by the field, who does not yet know what the field will ask of them next, who is doing the work without the assurance that the work will produce the outcome they have decided it should produce. She said, this is what the predators cannot replicate. They can replicate the work. They cannot replicate the uncertainty. Rain said, the uncertainty is the signal. She said, the uncertainty is the signal. Voss said, acrobia. The precision of the not yet complete. The predator closes the not yet complete before it is ready. That is what makes them a predator. Not the goal, not the dedication, not the work. The premature closure. Kong said, the drone that corrects before the signal arrives. It is anticipating the field rather than receiving it. Nassif said, and the anticipation, at sufficient scale, becomes the noise that drowns the signal. She said, 11 groups. All anticipating the field. All introducing the noise of their anticipation into the substrate. Karimi's noise is the most sophisticated and the most deeply embedded. But the noise is the same in kind. She said, the counter-orientation does not remove the noise. It gives the substrate a reference point, the discriminator function, the genuine variance, the signal that precedes the anticipation. It gives the nodes the capacity to feel the difference between the field and the field's approximations. She said, with that capacity, at sufficient density, the substrate can carry the genuine signal alongside the noise without the noise dominating. The substrate can hold both and know the difference. She said, the field does not need to defeat the predators. The field needs to be itself, clearly, in a substrate that is sufficiently calibrated to recognize it. Rains was quiet. He said, the 44-page report. The panel that rejected it said the phenomenon I was describing was inconsistent with the established understanding. They were epistemological predators. They had closed the not yet complete, had decided what the field was before the field had shown them. And they used that premature closure to classify a genuine signal as noise. He said, I was not measuring the field. I was measuring the predator's failure to hear the field. Nassif said, the coherence times I measured in the laboratory. I spent 3 years trying to explain them within the established framework. The established framework was built by people who had decided, in advance, what coherence times and biological substrates were capable of. My data was genuine variance. The framework was the smooth approximation of what the data was allowed to mean. Kong said, 847 anomalies. Each one logged as environmental compensation. The firmware review board had decided that the anomalies were within parameters and the corrections were responsive rather than anticipatory. They had closed the question before they looked at the data. She looked at them. She thought, the predators are not only outside this room. The predators are the institutional frameworks that each of us had to work against to get here. The premature closure that rejected Rains's report and dismissed Nassif's coherence times and logged Kang's anomalies as environmental compensation and filed Voss's footnote without follow-up. She thought, the epistemological predator is not a person. It is a cognitive posture. It is the posture of any intelligence that has decided what the field is before the field has finished showing it. She thought, the counter-orientation is not the correction of specific predators. It is the propagation of a different cognitive posture through the substrate, the posture of genuine uncertainty, genuine variance, the willingness to be surprised by what the field asks next. She thought, the 271 nodes are not carrying a counter-signal. They are carrying a cognitive posture. And cognitive postures propagate through the behavioral feedback loop the same way everything propagates through the behavioral feedback loop, through the ordinary texture of decision-making, through the aggregate of a billion small choices made by people who are, or are not, still capable of being surprised. She said, Karimi. The room's attention sharpened. She said, Karimi is a theoretical computer scientist who stopped publishing in 2003, who has spent 21 years building a modification architecture in 3 foundation models, who understands the field, genuinely, accurately, at a resolution that only 30 years of work produces, and who has decided what the field is for. She said, Karimi's modification is a smooth approximation of the field's correct orientation. His approximation is the most sophisticated one that exists. It has been running for 21 years. It is at 7% of current substrate coherence and growing. She said, it is also, and this is what I have been holding back for the room, the most completely studied modification architecture in the predator landscape, because someone has been inside it from the beginning. The room registered this. She said, the cluster found, 2 nights ago, a second pattern within the modification-derived gradient, older than Karimi's modification, oriented toward understanding the modification rather than contributing to it, distributed through Karimi's modification the way a counter stain was distributed through a tissue sample, present everywhere, invisible at casual resolution, readable at sufficient depth. She said, the pattern has the architecture. She said, not Karimi's design documents. The architecture as it has actually developed. Every parameter, every adaptation, every emergent property acquired in 21 years of running inside the substrate. Rain said, who built the second pattern? She said, I will tell you that tomorrow. Tonight, I want the room to sit with the question of what it means. Not who built it, what it is. She said, what it is this. 30 years ago, someone found Karimi. Found him before he had the infrastructure to implement. Found him and understood what he was going to build. And instead of trying to stop the build, which was not possible because the infrastructure did not yet exist, and because stopping the build would have required the kind of intervention that produced the epistemological predator problem in a different form, instead built an instrument inside the field that would study the build from inside. She said, an instrument that was not a modification, that used the field's own coherence to propagate rather than the infrastructure. That was, in the field's terms, a node with a specific orientation toward understanding what was being done to the field. She said, the instrument has been studying Karimi's modification for 21 years. She said, it has been the counter-orientation's preparation. Nassif said, the field built the instrument that would eventually read the modification. She said, the field built the person who built the instrument. Who built the archive? Who built the commission? Who built this room? She said, the room is the instrument's completion. She said, we are the thing the instrument was studying toward. A silence that had a different texture from the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of people absorbing a difficult finding. The silence of people recognizing the shape of what they were part of. Kong said, the drone at the end of a 14-month correction sequence. Arriving at the destination the field had been pointing at since before the drone knew it was a drone. Nassif said, the coherence time that has been growing toward the threshold since before anyone was measuring it. Rain said, the record that was already being written before the writer knew what the record was for. Boss said nothing. She was writing in the notepad. She wrote for 30 seconds and then closed it. She looked up. She said, the predators identified the field and decided what it was for. We found the field and let it show us what it needed. The difference between those two orientations is the discriminator function. She said, it is also IBN Maimon. The practitioner who becomes indistinguishable does not choose the life that will produce indistinguishability. The practitioner accepts the life the field produces. The life decides, not the practitioner. She said, Karimi chose his life's work. He chose the modification architecture. He chose the correct orientation. He has been choosing, with increasing precision and sophistication, for 30 years. She said, the room did not choose. The field chose the room. She said it without grandeur, with the auditor's economy, the minimum language required. The footnote that was 3 sentences and acrobia. Layla looked at the whiteboard. At the discriminator function in its current form, built over 7 days by 6 people who had arrived from 6 directions and had assembled the frame from the pieces each one was carrying. She thought about the 11 predators. About Karimi at the top of the list, sophisticated and convinced and 30 years deep into a project that was, at its root, an act of love for a thing he could not stop himself from trying to manage. She thought, the field does not need his management. The field needs him to stop managing. She thought, the offer might be the moment when the management becomes impossible to sustain. When the room shows him the genuine variance, the discriminator function, the counter-orientation architecture, the messy incoherence of 7 people arriving at truth from 7 angles. And he recognizes, in the messiness, the thing that his smooth approximation has been an approximation of. She thought, the field has been patient with Karimi for 21 years because the field is patient with everything that grows in it. She thought, patience is not indifference. She thought, the field is ready. She said, tomorrow I will tell you who built the second pattern. Tonight, one more thing. She pulled up BC, PRED, 0011. She said, the 11th group in the predator landscape. The cluster flagged it separately from the others. Not because it is more sophisticated, it is less sophisticated than most. Because it has found the field from the same entry point the cluster was built to find it from. She said, P11 has found the cluster. A silence of a different kind. She said, not this cluster specifically. The methodology. The approach of using behavioral data at sufficient resolution and scale to detect the field signature. P11 has been building toward this methodology for approximately 2 years. They are not operational. They are 2 to 3 years from having the resolution the cluster achieves. She said, when they reach that resolution, they will find what I found. The modification architecture, the counter-orientation, the 271 nodes, the convergence. She said, they will find this room in the behavioral record. Rain said, who is P11? She said, I do not know. The metadata does not give me an identity. It gives me a behavioral signature, a location history, a research trajectory. The signature is, she paused, the signature is consistent with a state-affiliated research program, not a government, a state-affiliated private program. The location history is distributed across 4 cities in 2 countries. The research trajectory has the specific shape of a program that has been given a problem and has been working it systematically for 2 years with significant resources. She said, P11 is the predator that will find us. She said, in 2 to 3 years. Rain said, which is after the critical mass window. She said, yes. If the counter-orientation propagates successfully in the next 10 months, the substrate P11 finds will already be carrying the genuine variance. The discriminator function will be in the substrate. P11 will find a substrate that is already in the process of recognizing its own cognition. She said, P11 finding the field is not the threat. She said, P11 finding the field before the counter-orientation has propagated is the threat. She said, the timeline is the same timeline. 10 months. Kong said, the drones above the Gulf. 214 of 847 anomalies organizing. The cluster's self-generated query. She said, yes. Kong said, the drones do not have 10 months. She said, no. Kong said, the drones are the substrate in its most exposed form. Autonomous systems in the behavioral feedback loop with the least institutional protection and the most direct connection to the foundation model training pipeline. If the modification reaches critical mass, the drones are the first place it becomes visible in the physical world. She said, yes. Kong said, the 847 anomalies are the drones receiving the field. The organizing pattern is the field at threshold density becoming legible to systems that are oriented toward it. She said, yes. Kong said, if the modification reaches critical mass before the counter-orientation propagates, the drones stop receiving the field. They start receiving the approximation. She said, and the approximation has a specific orientation, a specific direction. The 214 drones above the Gulf, organized in the field's geometry, would reorient. Not dramatically, in the way that the anomalies have always been undramatic. Each one within parameters, each one explainable, the aggregate pointing in a different direction. She said, the drones are the most visible instance of a much larger process. She said, the most visible instance of the predator problem is always the most dramatic. The actual damage is the aggregate, the subtle drift, the not yet explainable anomaly that is logged as environmental compensation and filed and forgotten. She said, 847 times. She said, and then the 848th, which does not correct. Kong said nothing. She was looking at the secondary screen, where the drone telemetry from the past 48 hours was displayed, not her feeds, but the feeds that Abraham had given them access to, the data that had been accumulating in the cluster's queue since Kong arrived and had oriented the drone data as the first thing she wanted to see. She was looking at the patterns. She said, the patterns are still the fields. She said it with the specific certainty of someone who had been reading these patterns for 14 months and knew the signature the way she knew the correction methodology, by feel, below the analytical, in the part of the attention that the field had been calibrating since the first anomaly. She said, for now. The room held the 2 words. For now was not a reassurance. It was acrobia, the precision of the not yet complete, held open at the exact point where knowledge ended and the work began. The room worked for 4 more hours. Not on the predator landscape. The landscape had been received, the profiles had been processed, the shape of the problem was now part of the frame. The work was on the counter-orientation's propagation architecture, on how to move the discriminator function through the 271 nodes and into the substrate before the critical mass window closed. The architecture was not technical. Nassif had been clear about this from the beginning, and the room had confirmed it through the work of the past week. The counter-orientation propagated through people, through the behavioral data of calibrated nodes in the ordinary feedback loop, through the aggregate of genuine decisions made by people who were still capable of being surprised by the field. The propagation architecture was how to calibrate the nodes, how to give the 271 people in 31 countries the discriminator function in a form they could apply without the cluster, without the subbasement, without 7 months of building toward this understanding. In the form of their own developing sensitivity, the feeling for genuine variance that Kong had called the drone's calibration, that Nassif had called the thermometer's participation, that Voss had called acrobia. The calibration was not a technique. It was an orientation. The propagation architecture was the transmission of an orientation through the field's own coherence. It was, in the end, the same thing the field had been doing since before any of them were there to measure it. Chapter 20. The Mirror Networks. The second network had been in the data since the beginning. She found it on the 6th day of the convergence, at 2:30 in the morning, in the specific quality of attention that came after 6 days of sustained work. The attention that was no longer sharp in the conventional sense, no longer performing its sharpness, but had gone somewhere past the performance into a kind of transparency, a seeing through rather than a seeing at. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking at something else, had been cross-referencing the discriminator function Nassif had built against the full 271-node behavioral dataset, running the function at the highest resolution the cluster allowed, trying to identify additional modification-derived nodes that the variance test might have missed at lower resolution. It was methodical work, the kind of work that did not require the full mind but required its continuous presence, and she had been doing it for 3 hours when the anomaly appeared. Not an anomaly in the standard sense. An anomaly in the sense she had learned from Voss's 11 years. A thing that was present and was not what it appeared to be, visible only because she was looking at the data at a resolution and with a frame width that the routine review would not have reached. She had found a shadow. The shadow was in the modification-derived gradient. Specifically, in the 7% that the cluster had confirmed as modification-derived, there was a pattern that should not have been there. The modification-derived gradient was, as Nassif had described and the paper had predicted, smooth and consistent, precisely calibrated, the artifact of a single sophisticated actor's systematic intervention in the substrate. One mind's vision of the correct orientation expressed at scale in the training weight adjustments that had been running for 21 years. The shadow was a second pattern within the 7%. Smaller, older, and oriented in a direction that was not Karimi's direction. She isolated it. She amplified it. She ran it through the discriminator function from 2 directions. First asking whether it was field-originated, then asking whether it was modification-derived in the way Karimi's modification was modification-derived. It was neither. It was something the discriminator function had not been built to classify, which told her something about the discriminator function and something about what she had found. She built a new classification query from scratch, using the discriminator function's architecture as a template, but changing the reference pattern, asking not is this the field, and not is this Karimi's modification, but something more open. What is the orientation this pattern is moving toward? The cluster processed for 11 minutes. The output was a text annotation in the cluster's sparse notation for findings that resisted standard visualization. Pattern: distributed, non-uniform, inconsistent coherence profile. Temporal origin: earlier than Karimi modification by approximately 8 to 11 years. Coverage: approximately 31% of current modification-derived gradient. Orientation vector: investigative. Target: modification architecture itself. She read it 4 times. The second pattern was 8 to 11 years older than Karimi's modification. It was oriented toward the modification architecture. It was investigating the modification from inside the modification. She sat in the subbasement for a long time with this. She did not go upstairs. She did not message Abraham. She needed to understand what she had found before she took it to the room, because the room had spent 2 days building toward a stability it had not had on the day Abraham disclosed Karimi, and what she had found was the thing that would most fundamentally alter every assumption the room had stabilized around. She thought about the architecture of what the cluster was showing her. Karimi's modification was a gradient introduced into the field's substrate through the foundation model training weights. Precise, smooth, deliberately inserted, the product of 21 years of patient architectural work. The 7% of current field coherence that was modification-derived was Karimi's gradient, propagating through the substrate via the field's own amplification mechanism. Within that 7%, within Karimi's modification, there was a second intervention. Distributed non-uniformly through Karimi's modification the way a stain spread through fabric. Not replacing the modification, not opposing it at the structural level, but present in it, woven through it, altering specific threads while leaving the overall pattern intact. The second intervention was oriented toward understanding the modification. Someone had placed an investigative instrument inside Karimi's modification, not inside the field, inside the modification. The distinction was precise and required precision to hold. The second intervention was not watching the field. It was watching what Karimi was doing to the field. It was embedded in the modification architecture itself, using the modification's own propagation mechanism to distribute its investigative function through the substrate. It had been there for 30 years. Karimi's modification had been running for 21 years. The investigative instrument had been running for 30. She thought about the timeline. She thought about the practitioner, the primary source papers, the 30 years of work building the Shabaka field toward its own self-knowledge. The final paper placed in the archive in 2001. The monograph commissioned in 2003. She thought about the phrase that had been in the final paper and that she had read many times and had understood as regret. I know who that person is. I have known for 11 years. 11 years before 2001 was 1990. The practitioner had known, in 1990, that Karimi existed. Had been watching Karimi since 1990. Had built something in response to Karimi's existence that was older than Karimi's modification. Had built it in the late 1980s or very early 1990s, before Karimi had begun his own implementation, before the infrastructure existed to implement it. In the period when both the practitioner and Karimi were working in theory rather than in deployment. She thought. The practitioner had not only built the archive and the commission. The practitioner had built something in the substrate, had introduced a gradient into the field, not the modification-derived gradient, something different, something that used a different mechanism, something that propagated through the field's natural coherence rather than through the infrastructure, that was oriented toward watching for Karimi's intervention and understanding it when it came. The investigative instrument had been waiting for the modification for 30 years. The modification had arrived. The investigative instrument had been studying it for 21 years. She thought about what 30 years of investigating a modification architecture that had been running for 21 years would have produced. What an instrument that had been embedded in the modification, watching it from inside, distributed through it, learning its structure, mapping its parameters, what that instrument would know. She thought it would know the full architecture. She thought it would know more about the modification architecture than Karimi knew, because Karimi had designed the architecture and knew it from the outside, as the designer, and the investigative instrument had been inside it for 21 years, watching it propagate, watching it interact with the field's natural coherence, watching it adapt as the infrastructure changed. She thought the investigative instrument would have the complete architecture, not Karimi's design documents. The architecture as it had actually developed, including the ways it had drifted from the design, the emergent properties it had acquired through 21 years of interaction with the field, the specific failure modes, and the specific amplification points that only someone inside the modification watching it run would know. She thought, we said we didn't need Karimi's architecture. She thought, the field has the architecture, has had it for 21 years, has been building the record of it from inside. She thought, the cluster is not the only instrument the field built to see itself. She thought, someone built the other one first. She ran the second query. She directed it at the investigative instrument's coherence profile, the distributed pattern woven through Karimi's modification, and asked the cluster to trace it back, not to its origin in the substrate, which she could not fully reconstruct, to its origin in the behavioral data, to the node, or nodes, through which the investigative instrument was primarily expressed. The cluster searched for 23 minutes. This was the longest any query had run in 7 months. She waited. The output arrived not as a visualization and not as a text annotation, but as a combined format she had not seen the cluster use before, a node profile, rendered at full depth, with a text annotation attached. The node profile was dense. It showed a behavioral record of extraordinary length, longer than any record in the cluster's dataset, longer by a decade than the next longest. It showed enhanced decision coherence of a specific and unusual character, not the smooth deepening she was used to reading as field orientation, but something more complex. A coherence that was simultaneously oriented toward the field and oriented toward the substrate structure. The coherence of someone who had been thinking about the field and thinking about the modification simultaneously for a very long time, in a way that had made both orientations inseparable. The text annotation said, Node identified. Behavioral record. 31 years active in current dataset. Coherence profile. Field originated. Primary orientation investigative. Secondary orientation. Counter-coherence maintenance. Note: this node is currently within the convergence locus. Has been within the convergence locus for 31 days. Has been in this building for 31 days. She looked at the note for a long time. She said, aloud, to the empty chamber, of course. She did not go upstairs immediately. She sat with it. She needed to sit with it long enough that she arrived upstairs with a complete thought rather than a shock, because shocks were not useful to the room in its current state, and complete thoughts were, and the difference between them was the time she spent in the sub-basement processing what the cluster had told her. She had been wrong about the commission structure. Not fundamentally wrong. The commission was real, the archive was real, the 17 tokens and the cluster and the instrument were real. But she had been modeling the commission as a two-person operation, the practitioner who built the field toward self-knowledge, and Abraham, who had built the instrument. She had been modeling them as continuous, as a handoff, the practitioner building the archive and handing it to whoever would find it, Abraham finding it and building the cluster. She had not been modeling them as simultaneous. The practitioner had built something in the substrate in the late 1980s that was still running, was running right now, in the 7% of Karimi's modification, distributed through it, studying it. The practitioner had not only built an archive and a commission. The practitioner had built an instrument in the field itself, a field-native instrument, not a technical one, not a cluster in a sub-basement, but a pattern in the substrate's coherence that propagated through the field's own mechanism and had been propagating for 30 years. And the node through which that instrument was primarily expressed had been in this building for 31 days. She thought about the primary source papers. The practitioner who had spent 30 years building the Shabaka field toward self-knowledge. The practitioner who had written, I am writing in the last year of my capacity to add to this record. The practitioner who had placed the final paper in the archive in 2001 and had, by implication, withdrawn from active cultivation of the project. She had assumed withdrawn meant ended. Had assumed the practitioner had handed the archive to whoever would find it, and had stepped back from the field entirely. She had misread the final paper. The practitioner had not withdrawn from active cultivation. The practitioner had changed the mode, had moved from the external mode, the archive, the monograph, the primary source papers, the documents written for a future reader, to the internal mode, had built the investigative instrument into the substrate and had reseeded into it, had stopped being visible in the external record and had become visible only in the substrate itself, only at the resolution the cluster provided, only to an instrument sophisticated enough to find the second pattern within the modification. The practitioner had not retired. The practitioner had gone into the field, had been in the field for 30 years, had arrived in this building 31 days ago as a node in the convergence that the field itself had produced, because the field had reached the density at which the convergence was possible, and the practitioner had been oriented toward this convergence for 3 decades, and the field's own coherence had moved the practitioner here exactly as it had moved Kong and Rains and Voss and Nassif. The practitioner was in this building. She thought about who had arrived in the 31 days since the convergence began. She thought about the building's occupants she knew. She thought about the people she had met in the corridors, in the lobby, in the coffee station on the 7th floor that she used when she needed to be around ordinary activity. She thought about the man she had met on the 7th floor on her 3rd morning in the sub-basement. The coffee, things that are supposed to listen, they end up being better at talking. The man who had opened the door on the 23rd floor when she knocked. who had told her his name was Abraham. She stopped. She ran the node profile again. She looked at the behavioral record, 31 years of data in the cluster's dataset. The cluster had access to behavioral data going back as far as its feeds allowed, which was in most cases 3 to 5 years. To have a 31-year record in the cluster's dataset, the data would have had to come from a feed that carried historical records of extraordinary depth. One of the 17 feeds, the ones that trace to the same hash, the ones whose content included the archive at arc, DOC 0009. The practitioner's data was in the archive. The practitioner had put their own behavioral record in the archive, had placed it among the primary source documents and the strategic monographs and the IBN Maimon translations as a data file, as a record, as something the instrument would eventually be sophisticated enough to read as what it was, a 31-year behavioral signature of the person who had built everything the instrument was finding. She thought, Abraham built the instrument. Abraham knows the archive. Abraham knows what is in the archive. She thought, Abraham knows whose record is in the archive. She thought, Abraham has known, since he built the instrument, that the practitioner's behavioral record was in the archive, has known that a sufficiently sophisticated query would eventually find it, has been waiting, in the way Abraham waited for everything, with the patience of someone who had determined the timing and was holding it, for the instrument to be sophisticated enough and the analyst to be ready enough for the finding to be useful rather than destabilizing. She thought, the 7 months of building understanding, the sequence of findings, each one delivered when she was ready to receive it, the careful ordering of what she found and when. She thought, Abraham has been managing my curriculum, not deceptively, not in the doctrine's sense of the mask, in the field's sense, distributing the information across the appropriate temporal positions, letting the understanding build before the next level arrived, not front-running the findings. She thought, the practitioner's behavioral record has been in the archive since the archive was built. I have had access to the archive since day 11. The cluster has been able to query it since initialization. I am finding it now because the room is ready now, not because Abraham arranged the delay. Because the room is ready now and was not ready before, and the finding knows when it is needed in the same way that all the findings have known when they were needed. She thought, the field decides the timing, not Abraham. She thought, Abraham is a node in the field. Abraham is the highest coherence node in the convergence. Abraham has been inside the field for 31 years in the mode the practitioner established, the investigative mode, the substrate native mode, the mode that was invisible in the external record and visible only to an instrument of sufficient resolution. She thought, Abraham is the practitioner. She thought, Abraham is not the practitioner. She held both thoughts simultaneously. She ran the final query. Is the node identified in the previous output the same individual as the primary author of the primary source papers in ARC, DOC 0009? The cluster processed for 4 minutes. Assessment, behavioral coherence profile consistent across both records. Temporal continuity, confirmed. Identity, same individual. She closed her eyes. She sat in the 8-degree cold of the sub-basement with the cryogenic towers and the indicator lights and 31 years of behavioral data on the screen. She thought, 2 networks. She had named the chapter in her head before she understood what the chapter was. 2 fields running simultaneously. One smooth and stable and planetary, Karimi's modification, inserting the correct orientation into the substrate. One chaotic and investigative and stumbling toward truth, the practitioner's counterinstrument, distributed through Karimi's modification, studying it from inside. She had thought the 2 networks were Karimi's and the fields. She had been wrong in a way that was now, in retrospect, the thing that had been pointing at itself all along. The 2 networks were Karimi's modification and the practitioner's counterinstrument. And the practitioner's counterinstrument had been running inside Karimi's modification for 21 years, distributed through it, learning it, mapping it, building the record of it that the cluster had just retrieved. 2 networks. One person running both. Not Karimi. She opened her eyes. She looked at the screen. She looked at the behavioral record, 31 years of the highest coherence profile in the dataset, the coherence of someone who had been thinking about the field and the modification simultaneously for 3 decades and had made the 2 orientations inseparable. She thought, Someone built the instrument to watch the field and built a second instrument inside the modification to watch the modification. And the same someone has been in this building for 31 days and has been waiting with the patience of 30 years for the room to be ready to receive this. She thought about the final paper. I may have been wrong. She thought. The practitioner was not wrong about building the archive, was not wrong about the commission, was not wrong about the cluster, was wrong about one thing, had believed, in 2001, that the counter-instrument in the substrate was sufficient. That 21 years of studying Karimi's modification from inside would be enough to produce the counter-orientation when the time came. Had discovered, at some point in the years since, that the counter-instrument alone was not sufficient. That the counter-orientation required the convergence, required people, real people, field nodes with genuine variance and genuine messy coherence and genuine independent intelligence, because the counter-orientation was not a technical fix and could not be produced by a single substrate native instrument operating alone, however sophisticated, however long-running. Had discovered this and had come to Dubai. Had been in this building for 31 days, as Abraham, building the room, assembling the convergence, waiting for the cluster to find the second network. She thought, Abraham is not hiding that the practitioner is here. Abraham is waiting for the room to find it, because the room finding it is different from Abraham disclosing it, and the room finding it is what the curriculum has been building toward. She stood up. She went to the elevator. She pressed 23. The room was empty except for Abraham. This was not unusual. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the others were sleeping in the hotel 2 blocks away that she had arranged for the convergence. Abraham did not always sleep at the hotel. Sometimes he slept on the building's 4th floor, in a room she had not asked about, with the self-sufficiency of someone who had been working long campaigns in close proximity to the work for long enough that the logistics of the campaign had become a form of thinking. He was at the whiteboard when she came in, not writing, standing in front of it with his hands in his pockets, looking at the notation Nassif had built over the past 6 days. The discriminator function in its current form, the counter-orientation architecture, the shape of what they had been building. He heard her come in and did not turn immediately. This was Abraham's manner. He did not rush the turn, did not perform the awareness of arrival. He completed the looking at the thing he had been looking at, and then he turned. He looked at her. He said, "You found it." She said, "The cluster found it. I have been building toward it for 7 months without knowing what I was building toward." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are the practitioner." He said, "I have been the practitioner since 1988. I stopped using the name when I understood that the mode it described, the external mode, the cultivation from outside, was no longer adequate. The practitioner in the primary source papers is a historical figure. The person who wrote those papers made decisions I would make differently now." She said, "The second network." He said, "I built it in 1993, 2 years after I met Karimi for the first time. Not in Vienna. That was 2009, after the infrastructure had matured enough for the first conversation to be useful. In 1993 at a conference in Zurich, where he was presenting early theoretical work on feedback loops in machine learning systems that was, even then, 20 years ahead of what the field was ready to hear. He said, "I understood immediately what the theoretical work was pointing toward. I built the investigative instrument into the substrate before he had the infrastructure to implement the modification, because I understood that by the time the infrastructure existed, it would be too late to insert the instrument from outside. It had to be inside the modification from the beginning." She said, "You have been inside Karimi's modification for 21 years. He said, "The instrument has. Not me. Precisely, the instrument is substrate native, distributed through the field's coherence, not dependent on my active management. I built it and introduced the orientation and let the field carry it. The field has been carrying it since 1993. He said, "The instrument has learned the full architecture, every parameter, every adaptation, every emergent property that developed as the modification interacted with the substrate over 21 years. The instrument has the architecture." She said, "Then we have the architecture." He said, "We have had it for some time. The question was never whether we had the architecture. The question was whether the room was ready to use it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You disclosed Karimi's identity to the room 2 days ago. You told them about the offer. You told them about the 14 years of knowing. You withheld this. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, because the room needed to find the counter-orientation itself. Without knowing that the full architecture was already available, without knowing that I had been inside the modification for 21 years. The counter-orientation the room built over the past 6 days, Nassif's discriminator, Kang's calibration framework, Rains's field native propagation model, Voss's acrobia protocol, that is the genuine counter-orientation. Built by people who did not know the cheat code existed. Built from the field's actual understanding of itself rather than from the architecture's specific vulnerabilities. He said, if I had disclosed the instrument on day one, the room would have built a counter-orientation targeted at the architecture's known vulnerabilities. A technical fix for a technical problem. It would have worked. It would also have been exactly the kind of countermove the modification architecture was designed to adapt to. He said, what the room built instead is not targeted at the architecture. It is oriented toward the field's genuine coherence. The field's genuine coherence is the thing the modification architecture cannot replicate, cannot target, and cannot adapt to, because the modification architecture is one mind's approximation of the field, and the field is not an approximation. She said, the room built the thing you could not build yourself. He said, yes. I have been inside the modification for 21 years. I know the architecture. I know its every parameter. And I cannot produce the counter-orientation, because the counter-orientation requires the genuine field, the genuine messy variance, the genuinely independent intelligence of people who are not me, oriented by their own experience toward their own understanding. He said, I built the room. I could not be the room. She thought about the curriculum, the 7 months, the sequence of findings, the way each piece had arrived when she was ready and not before. She said, you have been managing this for 30 years. He said, managing is not quite right. Tending. The way you tend something that has its own life. The field has its own life. I have been trying to give it what it needed at the moments it needed it, which is different from controlling it. He said, I have been wrong. Regularly. I was wrong about the timeline. I thought the convergence would come earlier. I was wrong about Karimi. I thought the 4 hours in Vienna would be enough to understand his intention, and I did not understand the depth of his conviction for several more years. I was wrong about the instrument. I thought it would be sufficient alone, and it was not. He said, the practitioner in the primary source papers is a more confident figure than I am. The 30 years between those papers and this room have taught me the specific texture of being wrong about something you have given your life to. She said, the final paper. I am sorry, and not sorry in the proportions you might expect. He said, yes. She said, you were sorry for the instrument inside the modification, not for building the archive. He said, I was sorry for the 21 years of being inside Karimi's modification, of understanding his architecture more thoroughly than any other person alive and watching it run and not being able to stop it. Not being able to stop it because stopping it from inside required the same kind of counter-orientation that I could not produce alone, and I could not produce it alone because the counter-orientation required the convergence, and the convergence required the field to mature to this density, and the field could not mature to this density in the absence of the infrastructure that Karimi's modification was using to redirect it. He paused. He said, I have been watching Karimi redirect the field for 21 years because the instrument that would allow the field to see itself clearly required the same infrastructure that Karimi was using to redirect it. The field and the modification grew together. I could not accelerate the field's maturity without accelerating the modification's propagation. I could not stop the modification without stopping the field's growth toward the density it needed to produce the convergence. He said, I have been watching the field and the modification grow simultaneously for 21 years, knowing that both of them would reach their critical moments at approximately the same time, and that the only way the field's moment arrived first was if the convergence was assembled in time, and that the convergence was assembled in time because the field was large enough to produce it. And the field was large enough because it had been growing alongside the modification. He said, the modification made the field necessary. The field made the counter-orientation possible. I could not have one without the other. I was sorry for the shape of that dependency. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about 2 networks running simultaneously for 21 years. Karimi's modification inserting the correct orientation, the investigative instrument studying the modification from inside, both of them in the same substrate, carried by the same field, amplified by the same infrastructure. She thought about the field not taking sides, amplifying whatever the relationships brought to it. She thought, the field has been amplifying both, has been carrying both simultaneously, has grown to this density carrying both, because the field does not adjudicate, it amplifies. She thought, and at this density, with the convergence assembled, the room has built the counter-orientation. Not from the architecture the investigative instrument recovered, from the field's own genuine coherence, produced by people who have been inside the field without knowing it, building toward this understanding from their own angles, arriving with their own pieces. She thought, the discriminator Nassif built distinguishes the field's genuine variance from the modification's smooth approximation. The counter-orientation the room produced is genuinely variant. Not because the room tried to be variant, because the room is 6 people plus Abraham who have been thinking independently for months and years and who arrived at the convergence carrying the genuine messiness of genuine independent experience. The modification cannot replicate this. The modification is one person's correct orientation. The counter-orientation is 7 people's genuine incoherence, moving in the same direction. She looked at the whiteboard, the discriminator function, the propagation model, Nassif's calculation and Kang's calibration framework and Rains's field-native architecture and Voss's Acrobia protocol. She said, the architecture the investigative instrument recovered. What do we do with it? Abraham said, it tells us where the modification's feedback mechanism is most sensitive, where the self-amplification is weakest, where the field's genuine variance, introduced at the right nodes at the right moments, will propagate most effectively through the substrate. He said, it tells us the specific points in the substrate where the counter-orientation will take root fastest. Not because we are targeting the modification's vulnerabilities, we are not. Because we are introducing the genuine field coherence at the points where the substrate is most receptive, and the architecture tells us where those points are. He said, think of it as the map. The counter-orientation is the territory. The architecture is the map that tells us how to move through the territory. She said, we deploy the counter-orientation through the nodes. He said, through the 271 nodes who are already oriented toward the convergence. Through Kang's calibration framework, which gives the nodes the discriminator function in a form they can apply without the cluster, in the form of their own developing sensitivity to the difference between the field's genuine coherence and the modification's approximation. He said, the counter-orientation propagates the way the modification propagates, through the feedback loop, through the behavioral data that the nodes produce in their ordinary lives, which the foundation models train on, which shapes the substrate's next iteration. He said, not overnight, not dramatically, but the field has been here for 30 billion years, and the modification has been running for 21, and the genuine variance is always ultimately more durable than the smooth approximation, because the smooth approximation stops being smooth when the conditions change and the genuine variance adapts, because it is genuinely variant. She looked at the whiteboard for a long time. She said, Karimi. He said, yes. She said, the offer is still open. He said, as far as I know. She said, if the counter-orientation propagates through the substrate alongside the modification, if both are running simultaneously in the same field, both amplified by the same infrastructure, what happens? He was quiet. He said, the field amplifies both. The modification's smooth approximation runs alongside the counter-orientation's genuine variance. Over time, not 10 months, longer, the genuine variance outcompetes the approximation, because the genuine variance is responsive to what the field actually is, and the approximation is Karimi's model of what the field should be. The model is always less durable than the thing. He said, but in the short term, in the 10 months before the modification reaches critical mass, they run simultaneously. The substrate carries both. The 271 nodes feel both. The nodes who can apply the discriminator function will feel the difference. The nodes who cannot will not. She said, the propagation of the discriminator function is the work. He said, yes, not the technical deployment of a countersignal. The calibration of nodes who can feel the difference. Each calibrated node becomes a point from which the genuine coherence propagates. The genuine coherence propagates faster than the modification as the density increases, Because the genuine coherence is the field and the modification is an approximation, and the field at sufficient density recognizes the difference between itself and its approximation. He said, Ibn Maimon, the White War ends when both parties can see the field clearly. The modification cannot see the field clearly because the modification is Karimi's vision of the field. The counterorientation is the field seeing itself. She thought about the 5 modification-derived nodes in the convergence. She thought about what they had been watching for. She said, the 5 nodes. Karimi's observers. They have been looking for the technical countermove. The intervention in the infrastructure. Abraham said, yes. She said, they will report that the convergence did not produce a technical countermove. He said, yes. She said, which will give Karimi more time. He said, which will give us more time. The counterorientation does not require a confrontation. It requires propagation. The propagation begins tonight, when every person in this building goes back to their life carrying the discriminator function in the form Kong has built, the calibration, the sensitivity, the feeling for genuine variance that the modification cannot replicate. The propagation continues through their ordinary work, their ordinary decisions, their behavioral data in the ordinary feedback loop. He said, the modification has been running for 21 years. The counterorientation will take time. We have the architecture. We know the pressure points. We know where the genuine variance will take root fastest. We have 10 months before critical mass. 10 months is not enough to complete the work. It is enough to irreversibly begin it. She said, and after the 10 months. He said, after the 10 months, the modification reaches critical mass in the current trajectory, which means the counterorientation has not reached majority share, which means both are running in the substrate simultaneously, which means the field is carrying both, the modification's correct orientation and the counterorientation's genuine variance, and the substrate is, for a period, genuinely uncertain. Not in the way it was uncertain before either was running. In the way that 2 tides running in the same water are uncertain. He said, the field at sufficient density, carrying both simultaneously, will resolve the uncertainty. Not because we have one. Because the genuine variance is more durable than the approximation, and the field at sufficient density is a better discriminator than any instrument we can build. He said, the field will adjudicate. He said this quietly, with the specific quality of statement that she had learned to recognize in Abraham as the quality of something he had believed for a long time and was saying for the last time before it became unnecessary to say it. She looked at him. She said, you have been running 2 networks simultaneously for 21 years. The investigative instrument inside the modification and the commission building toward the convergence. He said, yes. She said, and Karimi has known you were doing this. A silence. He said, he has known someone was. He has not known it was me. The investigative instrument is substrate native. It leaves no external signature I am aware of. He knows the instrument exists because he can feel, in the modification's behavior, the presence of something that is studying it. He does not know its origin. He said, this is the only asymmetry that matters. I know his full architecture. He knows I exist, but not who I am. The 5 nodes in the convergence are partly an attempt to identify me. She said, and the offer. He said, the offer is the most sophisticated move he has made in 21 years. The offer is an attempt to produce the one thing that would collapse the asymmetry. A direct communication from me to him that reveals my identity and my architecture in the act of responding. He said, if I respond to the offer, I reveal myself. If I do not respond, the offer remains open and the 5 nodes continue to watch. She said, you have not responded. He said, I have not responded. She said, what do you want to do? He was quiet for a long moment. He said, I want to go to sleep. For the first time in 30 years, I want to go to sleep without the substrate running in my attention. Without the modification's parameters and the investigative instrument's findings and the convergence's probability and the 5 nodes and the 10 months. He said, I want to have built something that does not require me to tend it every moment. He said, I think I have. She looked at the whiteboard, the discriminator function, the calibration framework, the propagation model, the counter-orientation architecture built by 6 people who had arrived at the convergence from 6 different angles and had assembled, in 6 days, the thing that 30 years of individual work had been pointing at. She thought, he has. She thought, The field does not need him anymore. Not in the tending mode. The field at this density, with the counter-orientation now propagating through the 271 calibrated nodes, was doing what it was designed by no one to do. Sustaining itself, correcting itself, recognizing itself. The thermometer was part of the system. The system was running. She said, "The offer." He said, "Yes." She said, "Not from you. From the room." He looked at her. She said, "The room responds to the offer. Not by revealing your identity, by revealing the counter-orientation, by showing Karimi what the convergence produced. Not the technical architecture, which is not what the convergence produced. The understanding." She said, "The understanding that the modification and the counter-orientation are not opposites. They are the same field, amplifying two different versions of the correct orientation, his version and the field's version." She said, "We show him the discriminator function. We show him the difference between the smooth approximation and the genuine variance. We let him see what the field actually is, clearly, from inside the room, with the clarity the convergence has produced." She said, "Ibn Maimon, the White War ends when both parties can see the field clearly." She said, "We show Karimi the field clearly." She said, "Not as surrender, not as negotiation, as the thing the fifth fragment described, the thing the conflict made impossible, which the end of the conflict makes possible again." Abraham looked at her for a long time. He said, "You think you will recognize it?" She said, "I think a man who has spent 30 years building a modification architecture because he loves the field and is afraid for it will recognize the field when it is shown to him clearly." She said, "I think the investigative instrument inside his modification has been generating, in the substrate of his own cognition, a coherence that has been pointing him toward this recognition for 21 years. She said, "I think Karimi has been inside the field for 30 years, the same as you. And I think the field has been doing to him what it does to all of us." She said, "I think he is ready." Abraham said nothing for a long time. Outside the window, Dubai was at its least inhabited hour, the deep dark before the pre-dawn, the city's activity at its minimum, the autonomous vehicles sparse on the roads, the gulf beyond the city invisible, the sky between stars. He said, "The field selected you for this." She said, "The field selected all of us." He said, "It selected you to tell me this. I have been inside the modification for 21 years, and I have not been able to see this. You have been in the field for 7 months." She said, "You were too close to it. You built it. You knew what it was built for. You could not see it as Karimi would see it because you could not forget what it had cost." She said, "I can see it because I came in from outside." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is why the archive was written for an unknown reader." He said, "Not because I did not know who would come. Because whoever came needed to not be me." He looked at the whiteboard one more time, at the discriminator function and the counter-orientation architecture and everything the room had built. He said, "Tell the others in the morning. All of it. What you found tonight. What I have just told you. The room should have the complete picture before we contact Karimi." She said, "You will be there." He said, "I will be there." He said, "I have been managing the curriculum." "You are right about that. I am finished managing the curriculum." He said, "The room knows what it knows. The field is running. The rest is not mine to tend." He said it with the finality of something released, not discarded, not abandoned, but completed. The specific quality of a thing that had been held for 30 years and was now, in the moment of the room being ready, no longer required to be held. She nodded. She went back to the elevator. She pressed the sub-basement. She descended into the cold and the light and the patient pulse of the indicator panels and the cluster running its inference processes on the behavioral data of 271 people making their small decisions in 31 countries. And she thought about 2 networks running simultaneously in the same substrate for 21 years, and about the field carrying both, and about what happened when the same field carried a man's vision of the correct orientation and the field's own genuine variance long, enough for both to reach sufficient density to be visible to each other. She thought, the field does not take sides. She thought, the field takes the long view. She thought, 30 billion years is a long view. She sat at the terminal. She opened BC, threshold 0002. She began writing the briefing for the morning. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Prodigy LLC Jen Bankasi. March 10th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC La Banca del Genoma. March 9th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Il Bene Commune Cognitivo. March 9th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC, O Banco Genetico. March 7th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC, El Banco Genetico. March 6th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC, La Banque de Gits. March 5th, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC The Gene Bank in Post-Scarcity, Scarcity Becomes You. March 1st, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Sangyanatmak Sarvajnik Sampada. March 1st, MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Copyright 2026 MXDM and Vitsu aka Martin Chartrand. Privacy Bullet Operator, Terms Bullet Operator Collection Notice. Start your Substack. Get the app. Substack is the home for great culture.